Hello, and welcome back to another issue of my Arcane Magic Guide for Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 2. This edition is going to focus on level 5 Arcane Magic. Great spell level. Looking back on it, there's some very powerful spells at this level. Then there's sort of a gap, and then there's a bunch of garbage that you don't want to be taking. But the great spells are very great, give you a ton of flexibility as an arcane magic user. And there's some funny mechanics in the bad spells that I was chuckling at as I was doing the prep for this video. So we'll get to go through all that. Just as a refresh on how I'm looking at these spells, I'm going to talk about spells with a really analytical, rules-focused, math-based approach, comparing spells to other spells in the level and talking about scalability, what works through the whole saga, what's situationally useful and when, versus spells that, have better alternatives at different levels or even inside the same level. I do usually play Baldur's Gate solo as a solo character with no NPCs. That's probably going to be biasing my ratings a little bit, but I'm going to analyze and try to rate these from a party play perspective, and everything's under core rules. Although I do play with SCS and the difficulty turned up, I'm going to talk about these spells under the unmodded base game and core rules, so that the analysis is useful for a wider audience. That said, I'll still talk about which spells are a little bit more or less useful in SCS and why, but the focus is on power gaming, so maximizing the strengths of your arcane magic users in the base game with core rules. And we've got this little rating system here. I rate spells from 1 to 10. A rating of 1 is a uniquely bad spell, one of the few worst spells in the game. Actually, at level 5, we have an unusually high number of rating 1 horrible spells that are bad for various reasons, all the way up to rating 10, one of the few game-changing or game-breaking spells representing a huge power spike when you obtain it. We had the first rating 10 spell at level 4 in Stone Skin, and TBD whether there will be another one in level 5. There are some very strong, versatile spells at this level, as I was saying. So, with the intro behind us, I'll just say appreciate everyone watching these videos and people giving their comments. I probably do have a couple controversial views at this spell level. A couple spells that I think are way better than other spell guides or comments I see online give them credit for, and probably some things that I'm gonna drive down the ranking list for reasons I'll try to explain. Hopefully you learn something about these spells and the way that the rules work one way or another. And if you disagree with me, put a comment in there. If you think I missed something, I always love getting ideas for playthroughs or different strategies from the comments. And you guys are smart and have a lot of experience playing this game. So right away, all right, let's go. We'll start. As usual, we're going to do this in alphabetical order. So we'll start at the very top of the spell list alphabetically, and that means we're going to start with Animate Dead. Animate Dead is a necromancy spell. It has a cast time of 9, the maximum length, a duration of 8 hours, and this spell causes a skeleton warrior to rise and serve the caster under any conditions. The type of skeleton warrior that appears depends upon the level of the wizard casting the spell. And then the spell description lists out the different skeletons that you get. There's a 3 HD skeleton at 1st through 6th level, which really is almost irrelevant unless you've been level drained somehow, or you're casting off a scroll, or you're a wild mage and your level reduced down by a wild that level fluctuation that wild mages get whenever they cast a spell. Level 1 through 6 is not where you're going to be at, because you only get access to level 5 arcane spells once you hit experience level 9. So this is sort of, I think, a relic of the way that the divine spell description works, because divine casters do get this spell at level 3 instead of at level 5 in the arcane book. In any event, the first bracket, which is almost irrelevant, is at 1st through 6th level. You'll summon a 3 HD skeleton. At 7th through 10th, 5, 11th through 14th, 7, and at that point the skeleton will start to wield a +1 weapon. And then at level 15 and up, you'll summon a 9 HD skeleton warrior wielding a 2-handed sword +1. The skeleton warrior can follow the caster, remain in an area, and attack any creature entering the place. It remains animated until it is destroyed in combat, 8 hours pass, or it is turned. This spell cannot be dispelled. Okay, so what is this? Well, it's a summon spell, and I've said a lot how mages get a lot of really weak and useless summons. Like all the monster summoning spells suck. Spider Spawn at level 4 was pretty bad. You get all these variety of summons, and so few of the summons are actually good. Well, here is one of the few good, strong summon spells in the Arcane book. This spell is awesome. This is a great spell. You know, you could say, well, divine casters get this at level 3, and they get more spell slots, and as a mage, you have to wait till level 5. You know, don't think that way. That's that type of compare and despair thinking. Just be glad with what you have, that this spell kicks ass. It's good as a level 5 spell, even if it's even better and even more busted as a divine level 3 spell. So let's talk about exactly what this spell does and why I think it's so good. First, the duration is super long, 8 hours in-game time. So that's 40 in real life minutes. That means that realistically, these skeletons will be around until they either die or they're not able to follow you into the next area. Most likely, they're not going to be able to follow you into the next area, because as we'll get to, these things have a ton of resistances. It's one of the key reasons why they are good summons that make them really hard to kill. You know, these summons are so good and so sticky that with this 8-hour duration, you actually find yourself being able to heal these things up and, you know, take them throughout an entire dungeon or area with you. Now, whether the skeletons follow the party between different area transitions, it really varies. It's sort of unpredictable. I haven't been able to figure out the exact rules of how it's coded into the game. One thing's for sure, if you ever have to travel a certain distance between areas, so you have like a multiple hour travel time between areas of the map, then the skeletons aren't going to switch areas with you. But if you're doing something like popping into a building and then back out onto the street, or you're popping into a cave and then back out into the main area, sometimes if you have triggered something in the skeleton AI or the game AI that makes the summons follow your character around the map, even when you haven't ordered the skeleton to do so, then that follow mechanic will cause the skeleton to switch areas with you. So a lot of times on if you have 2 or 3 of these summoned, you can get 1 to 2 of them to follow you in and out of caves that you might pop into. Sort of unreliable, but that is useful considering the super long duration. You can take these with you as you go area to area within within one map area without needing to travel long distances. So that duration is amazing, longer than any other summons, 40 IRL minutes. That's awesome. Last thing I'll say about duration and sort of controlling these between areas, you want to make sure there's a button for it at bottom right of your screen. You can click it. it's a select all button. And that button is super useful because not only will it select your party, but it also select all summons. I keybind that to the tilde key on my keyboard at top left, and that is extremely useful for controlling summons, especially these skeletons, which last so long. You're going to be moving around with your party all the time. And if one of them goes off the screen, you can use that select all button to select the skeleton and get it to go where you want it to go, even if the skeleton is off the screen and out of vision of your party. So, get that select all keybind going, and you can use that to control these super long lasting skeletons better. All right, that's just sort of how the spell works. Now I'll get into what the summons are and what the specifics of the stats. And I'll skip over the first version again, 1st through 6th level. Given you're getting access to this spell at level 9, that's basically irrelevant. When you first get it for 2 levels, you're going to be at the 5 HD skeleton, and then once you hit 11th level, you get the 7 HD version, and 15th you get the 9 HD version. So I'll focus on those 3 versions. And I'll say this, I'm actually doing a Wild Mage run right now. I haven't really focused on Wild Magic in this guide. It's sort of its own entity, and it has pros and huge cons. I don't know that it's better than a base mage or a sorcerer, but in any event, this is one spell where Wild Magic is actually really useful because the 7 HD version is significantly more powerful than the 5 HD version. The 5 HD version is like a strong fighter in BG1. The 7 HD version is gonna just wreck most battles, especially if you have a few of them in BG1, even with SCS. So there's a big power spike, and if you're a wild mage, then every time you cast a spell, there's a random variance whether your spell level is treated as increased or decreased upon casting the spell. With Wild Magic, you can actually, through that minor variance, you can pip up into casting and summoning the higher level skeleton, even if you're below level 11 or you're below level 15. And if you're like level 9 getting the level 11 skelly, or level 11 maybe even getting the level 15 skelly in BG1, that makes a huge difference. Like that level 15 skeleton in BG1 is just going to trash entire battles. So that's something to keep in mind. This is for wild mages, this is an especially good spell. So the specific stats here. So the 5 HD version, by the way, I'm not really sure if hit dice, which is what HD stands for, is even a relevant concept when talking about summons. The game uses HD in the descriptions to describe the summons, but the way that the game is actually coded, if you look through the code, the HD doesn't actually mean that each time you summon one of these, there's a random roll for how many hit points it's going to have according to that number of hit die, plus a constitution bonus, like there would be for, a playable character. Instead, the different, quote, HD versions always have set amounts of HP. There's no randomness to it. So I think it's more accurate to call this like a level 5, a level 7, or a level 9 skeleton rather than this hit dice concept. But in any event, that's the way the game describes it, as hit dice, even though there's zero randomness. So that's how I'll refer to it too. The 5 HD skeleton has 40 hit points, an AC of 4, DACO of 15, 1.5 attacks per round, mid-single digit saves, so really low saves for a 40 HP or 5 level 5 type character. And it also has 100% cold resistance, 45% magic resistance, and 40 to 60% resistances to all physical damage except crushing. So 40% resistance to slashing, 50% piercing, and 60% missile. And in BG1, like late-ish, mid to late BG1, when you first get access to this, there are actually very few enemies that do crushing damage. There's not that many club wielders or clerics running around. You're facing a ton of archers and a ton of like guards with swords. So these resistances are no joke. It's huge to have 40 to 60% resistances to slashing, piercing, and missile. On top of the 45% magic res. Those are all extremely useful. So this is the 5 HD version, and this is already a strong fighter against BG1 level enemies. Especially given the low saves, like this is already an effective unit to tank and soak up spells against mages in BG1. Then once you get to a level 11 caster, you're summoning the 7 HD version, and there's a big power spike. I mean, the stats don't fully tell the story. It just feels like the 7 HD version is so much more destructive, even though there's only a 2 difference in Thaco. The 7 HD skeleton is going to boss a lot of fights in BG1. So the 7 HD version has 60 hit points, an AC of 3, a 13 Thaco, 1.5 APR again, still the same mid-single digit saves, so great saves. The same 100% cold resistance. Now magic resistance is up to 65% instead of 45%, and the same resistances to physical damage. So now you're looking at, a bit higher likelihood to hit, significantly higher magic resistance, the same great saves, and you've got 50% more HP, which goes a long way when you're talking about having, high resistances to physical damage. I mean, if this 7 HD version with 60 hit points is fighting against a guy with a sword, well, you have 40% resistance to slashing damage. So these 60 hit points are actually equivalent to something like 100 hit points. I'm sure I'm not doing the math exactly right, but like that's like a very beefy character. That would be a beefy party member to have at this stage in BG1 with 100 hit points. Never mind getting that via summons. So the 7 HD version is very strong in when you get it in BG1. Then the 9 HD version, this is where the spell caps out at level 15, has 80 HP, an AC of 2, a Thaco of 10, 2 APR, so much more powerful offensively, the same mid-single digit saves, and now you're up at 90% magic resistance, and the same physical resistances. By the way, the 9 HD version, this could be true for all of them, but I just checked it on this one. It has 18/51 strength, and it has 16 intelligence. 16. That's like smarter than a lot of the NPCs, okay? So basically this skeleton that actually has no brain, I don't think, because it's just a skull, is like super smart. They definitely don't show it. They just follow your party around and bash stuff. But I thought that was funny. 16 int. So like, okay, this thing can actually fight mind flayers, I guess. I'm not even sure if like psionics are even effective against undead. I don't think they are. But these are smart skellies. So now this is the highest level. You're not getting this till SOA, but even in SOA, when you do get it, this thing is awesome. 90% MR, 2 APR. These are summons that can hold their own all the way through throwing a ball. I don't need to list out the use cases. These things are awesome. Especially with SCS installed, when mages become even more busted and scary as enemies in Baldur's Gate 1. Sending in 3 or 4 of these skeletons and just having a mage empty their entire spellbook on them and still die is one of the safest ways to kill mages in BG1. And that holds through the beginning of BG2 as well. Later on, like once you get to mid BG2, enemy mages will start to use the level 6 spells Death Fog and Death Spell, which automatically kill all summoned creatures in the area of effect. And that will automatically insta-kill these skeletons, even though they have MR, because those anti-conjuration spells look through MR and saves and immediately kill all summoned creatures except Deva's summons Deva's demons and Planetar. So, once you get to enemies like liches that are casting Death Spell or Death Fog, then, that's sort of when you hit the limit of this being a powerful summons. But obviously that's a very high level enemy, and there's still tons of fights in all the way through BG2 and even in TOB where the 9 HD version is pretty tanky. It's going to distract enemies and be useful to you in a fight. These things also stay alive so long that it actually can be worth buffing them. If you have a couple clerics in your party that are also using this spell, but if you have a couple mages that stock up on these, you can have a group of 5 or 6 or 7 of these things. You're casting haste on them. You're casting all the priest buffs on them. You're using mass cure from your priests to heal them up after they've taken a little damage through all the resistances. And you can basically create this super scary undead horde that's just going to completely shred all your enemies unless they have a lot of spell protections up and stone skins and so forth. It's pretty awesome to do. If you're in BG1 and you're trying to pick up some XP, you can go to the Ankeg cave and haste up 2 or 3 of these things out of your level 5 spell slots and have them go to town on Ankegs and farm XP really easily. And in some of the toughest fights in BG2, BG1, like the fight on top of the Iron Throne, summoning a few of these things on the floor below can save your ass. If you ever are under duress, you can pop your party down to the floor below, and all of a sudden you have basically 3 or 4 ultra strong fighters with a bunch of MR and super low saves that are waiting there to ambush the enemy. So I love this spell. This is one of the best summons that you get through the entire game as a mage. This is what I'm taking with my first level 5 spell slots in BG1, just because physical damage and the ability to tank mages is so powerful in BG1. And there's still utility here. Stylistically, if you want to play as a summoner, you can do that all the way through TOB. There are other spells in the level that start to outshine this once you get more leveled and once enemies start to get access to Death Fog and Death Spell. But this is a spell that's super powerful right when you get it and still has pretty good scalability. Do not get all twisted up by the fact that this is a level 3 divine spell. That just means it's even more busted as a divine spell. This is one of the absolute best divine spells in the entire game. It's the most powerful spell that divine spellcasters get in all of BG1, in my view. Just because something is a rating 10 spell in the divine spellbook doesn't mean it's bad in the arcane spellbook just because you get it a couple levels later. Still a strong spell. So I'm going to rate this spell a 6 out of 10. A cool spell. It's really fun to be an evil mage, running around with a horde of these skeletons all hasted up and just whacking enemies. It's pretty awesome and effective. So 6 out of 10 rating for Animate Dead. Next up is Breach. Breach has a cast time of 5. It's an abjuration spell. It has an AoE of 1 creature, no save since this is a debuff. When this spell is cast at a creature, it breaches and dispels all of the specific and combat protections on the target creature. And then the spell description, which this is a Beamdog era, I think, spell description, actually goes on to list out all the different protection spells that are dispelled. I'm not going to read all those out. I'll just summarize this by saying that Breach is the spell in the game to take down enemy combat protections with certainty. And what do I mean by combat protections? I'm distinguishing between spell protections like minor major globe, spell turning, spell deflection, spell trap, anti-spell protections, and combat protections, which generally speaking are what protect you and your enemies against physical damage and elemental damage. So, the most common combat protections that you need to get rid of through Breach are protection from magical weapons and stone skin, as an example. When enemy mages have those up, there's no way to damage them. With physical damage, your fighters are useless, so you need to cast a spell on enemy mages that's going to get rid of those combat protections. Note that mirror image and invisibility are a third type of protection. Those are illusion spells that need to be dealt with through divination spells like True Sight or like Oracle that we'll get to later in this level. Those are not considered combat protections that you can deal with through Breach. So, 3 categories of protections: spell, combat, and illusion. And this spell Breach is the way, the primary way. I guess I should say it's the most reliable way. It's the one spell that guarantees to get rid of the enemy's combat protections. So, as I said, the 2 most common things that you need this spell to get rid of are enemy mages, stone skin, and protection from magical weapons, so that you can damage them with physical damage. This is important in the base game, but it's even more important in SCS. Enemy mages pre-buff themselves, and they're always using protection from magical weapons, and then using the several round duration of that spell to unload really nasty crowd controls or disable spells or instant kill spells on your party. So an enemy mage that is protected from physical damage and can cast freely without being interrupted is super scary. An enemy mage that has all their combat protections taken away through Breach is going to get killed in a few hits from your fighters. And it doesn't matter what spell protections they have up if that's your strategy. If your strategy is to eliminate the combat protections and then kill the mage with elemental, with like AoE damage, elemental damage, or magic damage, or physical damage, then all you need to do is use Breach, and then you can dispatch the mage quickly. So without needing to get rid of their spell protection. So this is an effective anti-mage spell. Of course, though, the alternative, there are a couple of alternatives to Breach that I'll go through for getting rid of enemy combat protections. You really have 2 choices. There's literally a couple alternatives, okay? One is the Wand of Spell Striking. There's only a couple of them in the entire game that you can pick up from, lootable crates and so forth. But once you get to level 9 and you're frequently casting Wish, one of the Wish options is to create a random wand, and that Wish selection creates wands of spell striking pretty regularly. So by the time you get to TOB and you're casting Wish a lot, we'll get into Wish much later at level 9, but amazing spell. By the time you're doing that, you are going to generate a decent amount of Breach spells via a wand. Obviously, before you get to late game, then you're not going to have access to many wands of spell striking, so this is a bit less of a viable option. But that is one of the alternatives to casting Breach, is to use the Wand of Spell Striking. The other alternative, which is much more readily available, is to cast Dispel or Remove Magic. We talked about those spells at level 3. And in particular, Remove Magic is a very powerful alternative to Breach, since it's AoE, it's party friendly, and it can hit invisible creatures. Breach is a single target spell. It needs to be targeted at one enemy. So if an enemy has improved invisibility up, or is totally invisible, then you're not going to be able to hit that enemy with a breach. But you can hit them with a remove magic. Now that's among the many reasons why I love remove magic, and I talked about that at length at level 3. But remove magic is really the main alternative to casting breach. Of course, as we went over at level 3, remove magic has a probabilistic chance of succeeding against each target, and that chance goes down by a lot if you're underleveled versus the spellcaster that casts the spells that you're trying to disable or debuff. So, there's an RNG aspect to remove magic that does not exist with breach. If breach hits, it's 100% effective. There's no roll of the dice. So obviously that's a major advantage for breach, and particularly earlier on in the saga, like mid BG2, when you are facing some powerful mages, but you might not have your own arcane casters be leveled that high yet. Remove magic is not going to be a great option for you because of the low success rate, and you're going to need to use breach. So I've covered, what this does and what the alternatives are that you might consider. I think the next thing to cover is probably what prevents breach or protects you or enemies from breach. You need to think about that before you're going to use this spell, whether there's something up that's going to prevent the spell from having its effect. And there's only a few things in the game that will prevent you from being able to effectively use breach against an enemy. The first one is, and I already covered this, but the first one is that that enemy can't be invisible or have improved invisibility up, because if so, they're not targetable by single target spells. So you need to purge the invisibility first, then cast the breach. Second, the defensive spell shield, which we'll get to later in level 5, it's a level 5 arcane spell, that will absorb one instance of breach and then be discharged. So if an enemy spellcaster has a spell shield up, then the first breach that you cast is just going to extinguish the shield, but not actually dispel the combat protections. Spell shield in the base game is pretty rare. Even high-level magic casters in the base game are rarely casting spell shield. In SCS, it's much, much more common. Of course, you can always get around this by casting 2 breaches. Breach has a cast time of 5, so that's instant cast with Vecna and Amulet of Power. You could stock and cast 2 breaches to go around a spell shield, but that's something to think about. Spell shield does block breach. Spell shield does not block dispel or remove magic. And then the third thing that can block your breach is immunity to spells below blank level. There are certain high-level enemies that just have an innate immunity to spells below a certain level. The main example I can think of is liches, who are immune to spells of level 5 or below. And that does include breach, right? Because breach is a level 5 spell. Now, I should also say that you would think that would also make liches immune to remove and dispel magic, but that's not the case. That's not the case. I've tested this out. Remove or dispel magic seems to be the only, at least one of the only, could be the only sub-level 5 spell that liches are actually not immune to. So, we're seeing little ways here and there why I keep going back to the fact that breach is probably a little bit overrated and remove magic is probably a little underrated. And I do really love remove magic. Remove these 3 ways that breach can be blocked. Number 1, invis. Number 2, spell shield. Number 3, immunity to spells below blank level. None of those 3 things block, dispel, or remove magic. So just, worth thinking about and incorporating into how you use the spell. Of course, so those are the 3 things that block breach. What are some noticeable things that I did not list there? Well, in the base game, spell immunity, abjuration does not block breach.
Breach will just totally ignore it because it's a spell protection and just go through it and dispel the combat protections, but not the spell immunity. That's in the base game. In SCS, this is fixed. So in SCS, spell immunity abjuration will actually protect enemy mages and yourself from breach. I think this is correct. This is probably the way the game should work. It's very stupid and counterintuitive that spell immunity abjuration does not protect against one of the key abjuration spells you would want to protect yourself against as a mage, which is breach. But that's the way it works in the base game. Like, as we'll get to with spell immunity later, spell immunity has all these weird little exclusions and quirks, and one of them is that somebody apparently decided that spell immunity abjuration would be too powerful if it blocked breach. So in the base game, breach just ignores spell immunity abjuration. Don't need to worry about it. And then, there are two other things that do not block breach. One of them I talked about at the head: spell trap, spell deflection, spell turning. All these spell protections do not block breach. There's simply no interaction. These non-spell shield spell interactions. There's just no interaction. Breach will not dispel them, and it won't be blocked by them. And the last thing is magic resistance. It says it right in this description. The target's magic resistance, if any, does not affect the spell. That's true. This spell ignores MR, which is handy. So I think I sort of gave all the quirks and details of this spell. I think the high level is that if you are over leveled, and you're open to a little bit of RNG in dispelling enemies in exchange for it being AoE, then Remove Magic is, I think, a better spell overall because it goes through improved invis or invis. It can work on liches. It ignores spell shield. But that's if you're very leveled. If you want 0 RNG, or if you're not over leveled, like early to mid BG2, and you're fighting powerful enemy spellcasters, then you're gonna need breach. You're gonna need it. Remove Magic is just not gonna be strong enough. So overall, this is one of those non-glamorous spells that's also an important spell, and there really aren't great alternatives. In the very late game, Wish will give you these wands of spell striking. It will also give you as a choice an AoE breach on all enemies in the area. So by very late game, I tend to not be taking breach at all. I'm relying on, in TOB, I'm relying on Remove Magic and wands and the Wish option. But until you get to that stage, all the way through the mid game, and even, very end of BG1, when you're facing a couple strong casters, like in the final battles in BG1, this is a quality spell that you're going to need to be able to fight enemy mages, who are some of the toughest enemies in the game in sort of middle of the saga. So I give Breach a rating of 6 out of 10. I think there's an argument it should be rated a 7. In SCS, it's definitely like a 7 or 8 out of 10 spell. In the base game, I think 6 out of 10. I do think that, generally speaking, Breach is a little bit overrated. You probably could do an entire run without it, just relying on multiple casts of Remove or Dispel Magic. And, I think that Remove Magic is probably a little underrated, and Breach is probably a little overrated because of the things that do block it. Invis, Spell Shield, doesn't work on liches, etc. But this is still a quality spell that you're going to want to have a couple stocked on your party for most of the mid game, to be able to quickly deal with enemy mages. So 6 out of 10 spell, definitely quality, and something that is going to be in your spell book for a lot of the saga. Okay. So we started out level 5 with 2 important two quality spells, and one in breach that is one of the few ways to do what it does. And now we're going to move into some of the less essential spells in the middle of our list alphabetically here, starting with Chaos. Chaos has a duration of 5 rounds plus 1 round per 6 levels, a cast time of 4, an AoE over a 15-foot radius, and the effects of this spell are identical to the 4th level spell Confusion in all respects. The victims wander around as if in a daze, sometimes wandering away, sometimes attacking either friend or foe. If the victim is 4th level or lower, she does not receive a saving throw versus the effects. However, if the victim is 5th level or higher, she receives a save versus spell with a -4 penalty. The spell lasts for the duration or until a successful dispel magic is cast. Okay, so what is this? This is the better version of the level 4 spell Confusion. The only difference is that there's an extra -2 penalty to save. Confusion had a -2 penalty. Now you have an extra -2 penalty to -4. And of course, the automatic impact at level 4 or lower enemies. That's the difference. The effect, if the enemies fail their save, the effect is still the same. They're going to have this sequence of going berserk, attacking what's nearest to them, or just wandering about or standing in place. So, first of all, I think this is a better spell than Confusion. There's only a 1 spell level difference, and now you're talking about a -4 penalty or -6 if you're an enchanter. And with a -4 penalty, this still works against many enemies in SOA and even in TOB at a -4 penalty. But this automatic versus victims of 4th level or lower, like, this is almost irrelevant. I mean, 4th level or lower, you're talking about early to mid BG1 type enemies. By the time you have access to Chaos, like, there's lots of ways for you to easily kill those enemies, so you don't need to crowd control them. So this is a better spell than Confusion. I think if you're somebody who thinks that Chaos and Confusion are really strong to stock yourself, then you should favor Chaos, because I think giving up a level 5 slot versus level 4 is sort of about equivalent, but the level 5 spell here is a lot stronger with the extra penalty to saves. That said, this is somewhat stylistic, but for all the reasons that I went through when talking about Confusion at level 4, I really don't like this spell versus damage spells or other options at the level. The RNG is not very helpful, even if the spell does go off, and it has a higher chance of going off, but even if the spell does affect an enemy, that's not going to interrupt their casting. It might not even stop them from attacking you, especially if you're closest to them. So it's like a crowd control that's RNG to even hit, and then if it does hit, it's unpredictable what the outcome is going to be, but it's certainly not going to immediately disable your enemies, and it's not going to make them easier for you to kill necessarily. Like, there's no speed or AC penalty, etc. If it goes off. So, the spell does basically what the name says, causes chaos, but as the player character, I hate chaos. I want predictability. I want my enemies to be stunned or, lose a lot of HP or slow down if I crowd control them, not potentially, continue doing exactly what they were doing the prior round. So I don't think this is a great debuff. That said, -4 penalty to saves is nothing to be scoffed at, and this is AoE, and it's also party friendly. So those are things that are nice about it. All in all, I'll rate this spell a 4 out of 10 for Chaos. I rated Confusion 3 out of 10. I do think this is the better option of the two, considering the extra penalty to save. So I'll go 4 out of 10. This is a decent crowd control spell. If you like crowd control spells, then this is not a bad one. You're sort of looking at the best crowd control spells up through level 5 being sleep at level 1, web at level 2, slow at level 3, I guess confusion at level 4, maybe emotion, hopelessness. Neither of those are quite on par, and then chaos at level 5. But I don't think it stacks up to some of the good damage spells or an Animate Dead, for example. So 4 out of 10 rating for chaos. Next up is Cloudkill. Cloudkill is an evocation spell, a cast time of 5, a duration of 1 turn, so that's 10 rounds, an AoE over a 15-foot radius. This spell generates a billowing cloud of ghastly yellowish-green vapors that is so toxic as to slay any creature with 4 or fewer hit dice, and causes creatures with 5 to 6 hit dice to roll saving throws versus poison with a -4 penalty or be slain. Holding one's breath has no effect on the lethality of the spell. Thanks. There's no hold breath button in Baldur's Gate, but great. Those above 6th level or 6th hit dice must leave the cloud immediately or suffer 1d10 points of poison damage each round while in the area of effect. Okay, so this is the first sort of I guess you have Ice Storm at level 4. This is one of the first sort of AoE, multi-round effects in the game. In the original game, in the original BG1 back in the day, there were maybe only a couple of level 5 spell scrolls that you could even find. I actually don't think with the XP cap before Tales of the Sword Coast, you could even cast level 5 spells except off a scroll in the original game. So when you find a level 5 spell in the original game, I think the only scroll is in either the Firewiner or Allcaster Ruins. I remember it being oh my god, this must be the best spell in the entire universe of Baldur's Gate. And it's got this amazing name, Cloudkill. Sounds so powerful. Wow. Okay. Are those impressions accurate? No. I mean, this is not a horrible spell, but this spell is also not really that strong when you place it in context of what we have today with the full saga and 9 levels of spell casting. So I guess BG2 and the enhanced editions spoiled us, because with that perspective, we can see that the spell's a bit less powerful than the scary name and the graphics suggest. So getting into the details, what does this do? Well, there's these two effects. There's a damage effect, a poison damage effect, and then there's this slaying effect against enemies with 6 or under hit dice. Again, so I'll talk about the slaying effect first, I think. Again, I'm not really sure if the hit die concept is really what's relevant, or if it really just means levels. There's this dynamic where hit dice is used to describe different creatures, but usually that just means the level of the creature. So essentially what this will do is automatically slay creatures up to level 4, and you'll have a chance with a -4 penalty versus poison, which is usually one of the easier saves to make, on par with death. But the penalty, it's a significant penalty, obviously. You'll have a chance to kill creatures with 5 to 6 hit dice. So what does that actually mean? How useful is that? We're really talking about BG1 level enemies here that you're going to have a chance to slay with this spell. I'll give some examples. An Ettercap is level 5, so we'll have a save. A Sword Spider is the same. By the time you get to BG2, like sort of the basic enemies in BG2, like UNT is level 7, so is immune to the slaying effect, and Otayuk, which is that ugly looking thing that one of them lives in the sewers and one of them lives in just outside the inner chambers in Irenicus's dungeon at the beginning. Those are level 10. So, as just some examples of some sort of not special enemies that you encounter, by the time you get to SOA, enemies are not going to be at the level where this is affecting them. And even the higher level enemies in BG1 that you face towards the end of BG1 are going to be outside the kill zone for this spell. So that, on first blush, that instant kill mechanic seems like, ooh, it's so powerful. But again, like Chaos being no save at level 4 enemies or below, by the time you have access to a level 5 spell, you have lots of ways to kill creatures like that. You could also just summon a skeleton, which is going to be around for 8 hours, and a skeleton can solo multiple enemies that are level 4 and below instead of a Cloudkill, and the skeleton will survive and can be used for 7 hours after that. Or you can just kill them with physical damage from fighters in your party. So I think the slaying effect is overrated at the end of the day, not very practical. You're not going to be stocking level 5 spells for the purpose of killing a bunch of goblins. And so that leaves us with just the poison damage effect as the other reason to take this spell. So let's talk about that for a second. This has a duration of 10 rounds. So if a creature's really in the AoE for all 10 rounds, that's 10d10 damage, or 10 to 100 poison damage for an average of 55 damage. That's decent damage. It's less than a maxed out Sunfire, which is sort of the best alternative damage spell at this level, which we'll get to later. But there's no save to the Cloudkill damage, right? It's not like 1d10 or half if save. So, the damage is decent over a long period of time, but that really is the issue. It's done so slowly over 10 rounds that's plenty of time for enemies to shred you, even if they would be killed by round 10. So I think the damage is okay, but casting this spell is not really about doing the damage. If you're just focused on doing damage as quickly as possible, you're going to choose Sunfire every time. I think the use case is really for interrupting spellcasting, given that this will go off once around every round for 10 rounds. And Cloudkill is actually pretty effective at that. You can stack it, and poison is a very uncommonly resisted damage type. There's not a way for enemy mages to protect themselves from it because there's no protection from poison spell. And this is AoE damage we're talking about here. So this will go through all the spell protections and combat protections that enemy mages might throw up. Really, the only thing that's going to protect enemy mages against taking damage from this is if they're naturally immune, like undead, or like liches, which are immune to level 5 and below spells. MR will also block this, so if enemy spellcasters have MR, that's another way they could avoid this. So, this is, of the different damage types you could choose, poison damage with no save is a pretty effective way to get through and interrupt enemy spellcasters. Of course, the flip side of this is that the spell is going to have the same negative impact on your own party. This is not party friendly, and it's not like you can load up your party with fire resistance, or there's no long lasting protection from poison spell to cast on your own party members to send them into fight. The Ring of Gax is probably the best item to avoid poison damage, given that it confers poison immunity, allowing a character wearing that ring to enter the Cloudkill area and not be damaged. But you know, you're gonna have to find a way to put the cloud on top of enemies and keep your own casters out of it. I think the other thing to consider with this spell is that this is castable from a wand, and there's a wand of Cloudkill available from the very beginning of BG2 that can be bought and resold to recharge it. So, you know, this is one of the few higher level spells at level 5 that you can cast off a wand, which is important because higher level spell slots are worth a premium, and if you can save any of them through using it through a wand, it immediately makes stocking the spell less good. I think to summarize, the damage, it's helpful because it's no save damage and it's in a weird damage type. So there is a place for this to interrupt enemy spellcasters. That said, the overall damage output is very slow. So, in the alternative to just trying to interrupt enemy spellcasters through the spell, you could instead be focused on stocking some breaches and Sunfires and, debuffing and then killing those mages rather than just trying to interrupt them. Not a useless spell, but one that's not fantastic, and there's definitely better alternatives. By the time you get to late BG2 or SOA, you're facing many more poison immune enemies. You're facing more liches that are just going to be immune to this. And this spell really doesn't have much scalability past, trying to interrupt enemy mages in early to mid BG2. And if you love it a lot, then you could always, just rely on the wand. So this is a far from essential spell. It's not a horrible spell, given the poison damage type, but it's weaker than either Cone of Cold or Sunfire for damage. And I just never end up taking this in my runs. Always find that those other damage spells at this level are more effective. So I'll rate Cloudkill a 3 out of 10. Next up is Cone of Cold, another damage spell. So high level, there are 3 damage spells basically at this level: Cloudkill, Cone of Cold, and Sunfire. And now we're going to talk about the second of them, which is Cone of Cold. Cone of Cold has a cast time of 5. The area of effect is an 18-foot cone with a 90-degree arc, fanning out from the caster. There's a saving throw for half damage. When this spell is cast, it generates a cone-shaped area of extreme cold originating at the wizard's hand and extending outward in a cone 18 feet long with a 90-degree arc. It drains heat and causes 1d4 plus 1 points of damage per level of the caster. For example, a 10th level wizard would cast a cone of cold causing 10d4 plus 10 points of damage. Okay, so this spell, it's a damage spell. It's one of the few spells in the game that does cold damage, so that's handy, just to have some variety for enemies that are immune to different types of elements. The spell does cap out at level 20, like basically every other spell in the game. So at maximum level, level 20 or above, you're doing 20d4 plus 20 points of damage from this spell. Now, I'll say that's basically the same as doing 1d6 damage per level. At first glance, it's like, ooh, this spell does 1d4 plus 1 instead of 1d6 per level. Like, that makes the spell more reliable or better. But the reality is, and this is not backed up by stats. Maybe somebody has the math on it or can show us. But both 1d6 and 1d4 plus 1 do an average of 3.5 points per damage. 1d4 plus 1 has a lower standard deviation, so maybe marginally more predictable. But the thing is, even from the moment that you get this spell at level 9, you're rolling a lot of dice anyway. You know, you're rolling 9 dice. And then at level 20, you're rolling 20 dice. So the standard deviation really shouldn't matter very much at all. Like at the end of the day, you know, your 6s are going to balance out your 1s on the 1d6. And so the 1d6 ends up looking almost exactly like 1d4 plus 1 when you're rolling that many dice. So it's like, you know, there's this funny complication in the way that the spell is written. Maybe it's a legacy of D&D. But that funny complication basically amounts to nothing. And like, it's just the same as every other damage spell, you know, doing an average of 3.5 points per level, and where a save will have the damage. So I think, you know, there are 2 damage spells really worth considering at level 5 that are, you know, quality to do damage. One is Sunfire and the other is Cone of Cold. So I think that we should compare these 2 spells for a second and talk a little bit more detail about the differences between them, and some specifics of cold damage and Cone of Cold that make me struggle with it. So Sunfire does cap out at 15d6. So, you know, once you get to level 16, the Cone of Cold is doing more damage on average than Sunfire, because then you're going to be at 16d4 plus 1 via the Cone of Cold, and only 15d6 from the Sunfire. So there is a little bit more scalability to Cone of Cold. Now, that said, I just think there are a couple dynamics to Cone of Cold that make it really hard to use in practice. First, the cone, which is a unique dynamic. I guess maybe Burning Hands is a similar dynamic, but you know, this huge arc that you're spraying out these cold waves into. This cone is really hard to aim in practice and to gauge how far it will go. Whenever I try to cast this, I always end up hitting fewer enemies than I'd like to, and a lot fewer than I feel like I'd hit with just a regular AoE or like Sunfire that fans out in a circle from the caster. Part of the problem too is that the cone expands in width as it gets further away from the mage. So if enemies are closing in on you as the spellcaster, then they might, and especially if they start to surround you, you're only going to be able to hit 1 or 2 of them with the cone. To really perfect this, you have to line it all up perfectly, that you're like exactly the right distance away from the enemies, so they're not out the back of the cone, but they're not too close to you, because if they're too close to you, they're going to come out the sides of the front of the cone. It's a pain in the ass, and it's always, the AoE is always smaller than I think it should be. So I'll try to cast this and end up hitting like one of the 5 onrushing enemies and being like, oh crap, I should have just cast a fireball or a skull trap, or I wish I had a Sunfire. So the cone dynamic is annoying and hard to aim. The second thing about this spell as compared to Sunfire is that this spell has a cast time of 5 for Cone of Cold, whereas Sunfire has a cast time of 3. That is important when, you know, before you have Robe of Vecna, or if you're a spellcaster that doesn't have that equipment in your party, or only has the Amulet of Power. For damage spells, being able to get off a powerful damage spell more quickly is huge. So that's just an advantage. You know, not a huge advantage, but an advantage for Sunfire. You know, they're both instant cast if you have Amulet of Power and Vecna. So the distinction sort of goes away late game, but before you have those items, there is a meaningful difference. And then the last difference is obviously cold damage versus fire. So fire is more commonly resisted, and Cone of Cold is the best cold damage spell in the game. You know, all undead are immune to cold, but generally speaking, there's probably more enemies that are immune or resistant to fire than cold in this game. So I would say that cold damage is an advantage for Cone of Cold, except for the fact that cold damage has this dynamic written into the game that if you kill an enemy through cold damage, then the enemy will undergo an effect that's the same as a petrification spell. They'll freeze in place, and instead of dropping any of their items or gold, the enemy will just chunk and there'll be nothing left there. So if you kill enemies with this spell, it'll actually destroy those enemies' items and gold. So, that's like a major problem. I mean, it's great to get XP, but, we like killing enemies so that we can loot their corpses. And especially for higher level enemies where you want to use your most powerful spells against them, killing them and then not getting their items sucks. Like that's a huge reason or disadvantage of using a particular method of killing an enemy. Like most of the high level enemies in the entire saga are dropping critical items that you want or need or are going to make your party incrementally better. So you're never going to want to kill those enemies through a damage type that can disintegrate those items. So this is like, this is sort of a gameplay mechanic, but it is what it is, and it makes this spell just way worse than fire damage, which will always allow you to collect their enemies. Now, somebody on the BG2 wiki pointed out, and I actually did test this, and it's true, that if you go to your gameplay options and you disable gore, so if you uncheck the gore option in gameplay options, like, you're policing yourself, you're your own parent, then this chunk mechanic and freezing mechanic through cold damage will actually go away. It'll stop occurring. And cold damage will just kill enemies like any other type of damage, and you'll always be able to loot their bodies. So if you really wanted to use this spell, then theoretically you could disable gore and then use the spell and not have enemies lose their items. But like I have major problems like this. Like Baldur's Gate is almost not even Baldur's Gate if you can't chunk somebody when you hit a nice critical hit on them. Like I don't even know what game that is. It's not the game that I recognize. It's like I know that this guide is about like power gaming, but like let's face it, you're insane if you disable gore just to make this cold spell slightly better. Like I hate that. I can also envision some like crazy menu option micro where like you like wait until you cast the spell, then you go disable gore, let it go off, and then turn it back on so you get the gore back. It's like, craziness. There's really no way to go through really playing Baldur's Gate with gore off. Like I'm not even sure if that's really Baldur's Gate. That's like some other modded game that I don't want any part of. So yes, theoretically you can get rid of this game dynamic, but it's like totally philosophically unacceptable to do that. So I'm going to assess this spell on the basis that yes, it does destroy enemy items, and for that reason it's really hard to take over other damage types. So in conclusion, this is not a bad damage spell on paper because it gets you 20 levels of scaling. It's a rare elemental damage type, but in practice I find that I like Sunfire better for other reasons we'll get into more when we get to that spell. This item destruction mechanic is a killer, and even if that item destruction mechanic was not an issue, I still think that aiming this thing is just a pain in the ass and never seems to work reliably like the circular AoE spells that we all know and love. So I struggled with whether to give this spell a 4 out of 10 or 3, but ultimately, given the item destruction mechanics, I just never used this spell. So I went with the rating that's more reflective of my play patterns and will rate Cone of Cold a 3 out of 10. Okay, so we actually started out alphabetically with some of the better spells in the level. Nothing that's total garbage. A few different spells that have something to be said for them. Merits of varying degrees, but all have merit. Now we're going to get into some real trash. Okay. Conjure Lesser Air Elemental. This is a conjuration spell with a cast time of 9, the max cast time, a duration of 1 turn plus 1 round per level. A wizard who casts a Conjure Lesser Air Elemental spell summons an air elemental to do her bidding. The elemental has 8 hit dice and will serve the caster's every whim until banished back to its home plane. The spell's duration expires or the elemental dies. However, every time this spell is cast, there's a 15% chance that the elemental will escape the instructions of the caster, go berserk, and attack the wizard who dared summoning it. If it can't reach the summoner, it will fight its way toward her. This berserking elemental will also remain until slain or the spell's duration expires. The elemental is locked into a psychic contest with the caster for 3 rounds after being summoned. At the end of this time, if the caster has won, she has control of the elemental. However, if she has lost, the elemental goes berserk and tries to kill her. This does not prevent the use of other charm-type spells after the contest was lost. If charm spells are used before the contest is over, they will have no effect on the outcome. Wow, okay. A lot of word salad there. To describe what? Okay, this is the next in the series of horrible conjuration spells that mages get. This whole psychic contest thing and the chance that the elemental will escape instructions and go berserk, all this stuff. I'm pretty sure this was a Beamdog added spell, and these types of game mechanics really remind me of some of the less successful things that Beamdog did in this game, which involve a lot of complexity and contrivances and different rules upon rules to just get to an outcome that is not worth getting to and crappy in the first place. This is a classic example of that, because you have to go through all these different you stun yourself and sit there for 3 rounds. You go through all these different chances, this long spell description, just to get what? To get this summons, which as I'll get to in a little bit, is significantly worse than the worst skeleton warrior you could get from Animate Dead. So it's all this to do and different complexities to potentially produce one summons that's crappier than a summons that you can get guaranteed for 8 hours without any of these complexities through a different spell at the same level. It's sort of it reminds me a lot of the shaman mechanics with the spirit dance, where it's all these different complex rules about it, and these different items that buff it or don't buff it, and at the end of the day, you're just summoning these weak elementals that get crushed by any legit enemies. So it's all this to do and this complex game mechanic to just produce something that sucks anyway. And that's exactly what this spell is, and there's 2 more of them: Lesser Earth Elemental and Lesser Fire Elemental, which we'll get to. Okay, that's the high level of why this spell is garbage and sort of a shame. These game mechanics could have been sort of cool if what you were summoning was a demon that you should never have access to at level 5, or you could have a chance to summon a Deva or something that's actually a powerful summons and makes all these other random all this randomness and the fact you have to stun yourself worth it. That would make sense. You have to take risks to get something stronger. But instead it's okay, actually the thing that it summons, even if you take all these risks, is just crappier than the guaranteed skeleton you get for 8 hours. All right, whatever, sure. So talking more specifically about this, so obviously there's a 15% chance you just summon a hostile enemy I guess you have to do this out of combat. Like, there's no way you can cast this spell in combat because this psychic contest thing. What it means is that the caster is stunned for 3 rounds after casting the spell. Like, stunned. It's one of the worst debuffs that you could ever have against you in the entire game. You're going to get hit guaranteed. If there are any enemies around, you're going to be dead. So you have to cast this out of combat. You could never cast this solo because if you get stunned for 3 rounds and the hostile elemental is summoned, then very bad things are going to happen. The elemental, if you have full stone skins up, you're probably going to survive. But it's just not a path you generally want to go down. So like, you basically have to cast this spell, you have to be out of combat. You're getting ready for the fight, but it has to be just right before the fight because it only lasts for 10 turns plus 1 round per level. So like 20 to 30 rounds. So it's like right before the fight. You gather your whole party around. Like, you make sure that the fighters are ready to potentially kill this thing if it's the 15% chance, and then you cast it because you're going to stun yourself for 3 rounds. Fantastic. Okay, you have to cast it out of battle. And if you're successful and you go through all of that brain damage, what do you actually get? So like, let's talk about what you actually get. So what you get with this first one is a lesser air elemental. All right, what does it do? Okay, it has 64 hit points. It's always exactly 64, again, despite the reference to hit die. That's just the amount of health that it has. It has 64 hit points, an AC of 2, a 13 THAC0, a single APR, a 1 APR. So if you're a level 10 mage casting this, it's going to be around for 20 rounds. The maximum you could possibly get out of it is 20 auto attacks. That's it. 1 APR, saves in the low teens. So like, saves are twice as bad as the skeleton, the lowest level skeleton saves. 0 resistances at all. The lesser air elemental, like all these elementals, does get resistances to weapons of +1 or lower enchantment. So I guess that's the one thing that you could say that's special about this creature, is this immunity to weapons of +1 or lower. But that's only useful in BG1, and especially not by the end of BG1, by the time you actually have access to level 5 arcane spells. Like, almost all the enemies that you're fighting are going to be using +1. Somebody's going to have access to +2 weapons in the party. I guess, like, if you really wanted to be safe killing some hobgoblins, like, you like stay out of sight for 3 rounds, being stunned casting this, then you send it in, you hope with its 20 attacks it can kill a few of them, it's going to be whatever. You're not going to do this. Like, the alternative to doing all that is like, you just run in with 1 Sunfire and kill all the hobgoblins in one go. Enemies that are only using weapons of +1 or lower are going to be enemies that there's way easier ways to kill than conjuring up this crappy thing. And lastly, I think that the BG2 wiki says that lesser air elementals have some type of special ability, but in my install, just base game, there's 0 abilities or spells for this thing. All it can do is move around and attack once per round. That's it. Okay, so let's compare this summons to the lowest possible level skeleton warrior that you get at level 7 to 10. That thing has 40 hit points, so about 2/3 the hit points. It has AC of 4, so only 2 worse. 15 THAC0, so only 2 worse, but it has 1.5 attacks per round. So, much higher likelihood to do damage, considering that, even with the marginally lower THAC0. It has saves that are about twice as good. It has 100% cold resistance, 45% magic resistance, 40 to 60% resistances to all physical damage except crushing. All that completely negates the HP difference, plus more. So like even the skeleton warrior that you get at level 9 is at least equal to, and I would say better than, this lesser air elemental. And to summon that thing, there's no mental combat, there's no 15% chance, and it's going to be with you for 8 hours instead of 1 turn plus 1 round per level. Of course, by the time you get to the 7 HD or 9 HD skeletons, those things are just way better than this lesser air elemental. And you get access to those, starting at level 11 as a mage. So what is there to say? The thing that this summons sucks. It's going to get roasted by enemy mages or by any enemies that are striking with a +2 or higher weapon, which is, almost everybody that you're going to be fighting in real battles from the end of BG1 all the way through BG2. The duration is short. There's no reason to ever take this over Animate Dead. And the fact that there's a chance that what you summon could actually attack you and that you have to stun yourself for 3 rounds when you cast this spell, just a joke of a spell, really bad. When I see enemy mages, and there are a few of them in the game that will actually cast this spell, I'm like, this is the best thing ever. This is such a debuff for an enemy mage to stun themselves for 3 rounds. I'm like rejoicing when I see an enemy mage cast this spell. That's how you know that this is a truly crappy spell. Really bad. One of the worst spells in the game. And I rate this a 1 out of 10. Horrible spell. Okay, next up. There's more. Conjure Lesser Earth Elemental. Okay, this is... I'm not going to read the whole description. This is the same exact spell as Conjure Lesser Air Elemental, except that the conjuration that you get is different. So we already know it's going to be a bad spell unless this is like a super strong summons, and it's not. So the stats for the Lesser Earth Elemental: 64 hit points, AC of 2, 13 THAC0, 1 APR, low teen saves, no resistances, the same immunity to +1 or lower weapons. So, doesn't that sound a lot like the Lesser Air Elemental? Well, yes. In fact, the only difference that I could find between the Lesser Earth Elemental and the Lesser Air Elemental is that the Earth Elemental does 4d8 crushing damage per attack, whereas the Lesser Air Elemental does 1d20 crushing damage per attack. So 4d8 crushing versus 1d20. The 4d8 is a little bit better, but they're almost the same thing. And that's the only difference. The HP, the AC, the THAC0, the APR, the saves, the lack of resistances, and the weapon immunity is all exactly the same. So basically the only difference between these two spells is the appearance of the elemental that you summon. Very, very silly stuff. At least the elementals could have been somewhat different to make them situationally useful. What if the Lesser Earth Elemental had 100% electricity immunity or crushing immunity or something, and you could try to use them in different fights or something? You don't even get that. It's just the same crappy meal served back to you with a little piece of parsley on the side. It's still crap. Conjure Lesser Earth Elemental is a 1 out of 10 rating. Okay, last of the terrible trio here is Conjure Lesser Fire Elemental. This is the same spell, except now you get a Lesser Fire Elemental. The stats of the Lesser Fire Elemental are same 64 hit points, same AC2, same 13 THAC0, same 1 APR, same low teen saves. Same immunity to +1 or lower weapons. There is a slight difference here, though, because the lesser fire elemental does have 100% fire resistance, and it does 3d8 crushing damage plus 1d6 fire damage. So, there is at least some distinction here. The lesser fire elemental is clearly the best of the 3 elementals because of the 100% fire resistance. So, I guess that makes it the best of the worst. Like, this is the best of these 3 spells. Theoretically, you can summon one of these and then you're like casting Sunfires or Fireballs into the fight and not killing your summons. I guess that's something. Skeletons are still with their very low saves and their magic resistance, especially like the 90% resistant skeleton. Magic resistant skeleton you start to get at level 15. Like, they're going to be about as tanky in situations like that. But this is at least something. There's something to be said for this summons with the 100% fire resistance. The other dynamics of the spell, the 15% chance that you just summon an enemy. By the way, if you kill the summoned the Berserk Elemental that comes after your party, you get no XP as well because it's a summons. Just noting that. Like, not only do you have to kill it and there's a chance it kills you, and the spell is just wasted, but like, you don't even get XP for it. That's like, rubbing salt in the wound. But this summons not as bad as the other 2, but because of these other dynamics, and needing to stun yourself for 3 rounds, plus the short duration, plus the fact that the skeletons are still better, this is still a bad spell. I rated it 2 out of 10, though. I guess it's not one of the worst spells in the game, particularly when you have, earth and air elemental preceding it. So 2 out of 10 for Conjure Lesser Fire Elemental. All right, next spell is Domination. Domination is an enchantment spell. It has a duration of 8 rounds, a cast time of 5, an AoE of 1 creature, and a saving throw negates. The Domination spell enables the caster to control the actions of any creature while the spell is in effect. This control is maintained through a telepathic link between the caster and the victim. Unlike the 4th level priest spell, Mental Domination, the target has no option for release, even if made to do something against his morals. This effect can only be reversed by Dispel Magic. The target is allowed a saving throw versus spell with a -2 penalty to negate the effect. Okay, so what is this? This is the strongest charm spell in the game.
What is it?
This is just yet another charm spell, although it's called Domination. Just sort of recap, the first one appeared at level 1 with the charm spell, which gave enemies a +3 bonus to saves versus it. Then you had Dire Charm at level 3, which had no penalty or bonus. And now we get level 5 for Domination to get to a -2 penalty, or -4 if an enchanter is casting this. So, what is there to say? It has a much shorter duration at only 8 rounds. I guess if for some quest-related reason you need to max your chances of getting a charm off, or you want to keep one of these stocked to like charm back one of your party members and have the best shot, then this is your spell, because you do get the -2 penalty, the -2 penalty on it. That said, you're giving up a level 5 spell slot here. There's not really a use case where you couldn't just try to cast level 1 charm multiple times if you're doing this for some quest related reason. And as you get to mid BG2 and TOB, a -2 penalty is not that severe, and also so many enemies are wearing Helms of Charm protection or are just straight up immune to charm by the time you get you know, to the later stages of the saga, that this is just a tough spell to take and use. I really never take it or use it. For single target debuffs, there's things like Polymorph Other or even Feeblemind, which we'll get to in a second here, which if you really like single target debuffs or, you know, single target spells that are going to do nasty things to your enemies, you know, go with those ones instead of Domination, given how many enemies are immune to this. Not horrible because of the save penalty and thus being the strongest charm spell in the game. So I can't say this is like a 1 out of 10 spell, but not a great spell. Charm as a whole just isn't that effective an ability, especially when you get to higher levels where you have access to this spell. So I'll rate this a 2 out of 10 for Domination.
Let's continue. Here we go with the next spell in level 5, which is Feeblemind. Feeblemind is an enchantment / charm spell. It has a permanent duration, a cast time of 5. The area of effect is 1 creature, and a saving throw negates. Feeblemind causes the subject's intellect to degenerate into that of a simple beast of burden, unless a saving throw versus spell is made with a -2 penalty. Upon a failed saving throw, the subject remains in this state until a successful dispel magic is cast upon her. So what is this? Well, it's yet another single target debuff / disable spell. This one does come with a -2 saves penalty, which is helpful. If you're an enchanter, then this is going to work with a -4 penalty, and it does have a permanent duration. So if an enemy fails a save on this, you know, this effect is going to be in place until you kill that enemy, or a dispel magic is cast. Although, you know, enemies in Baldur's Gate, I think even with SCS, parties are not very good at you know, removing negative effects upon themselves, and especially in the base game, your enemies are never going to be casting dispel magic to save each other. So for all practical purposes, this is a permanent duration spell. The effect of the spell is to make the creature stand in place and do nothing. However, it's not a stun. So you don't get the benefits of having all your attacks hit the enemy like you do with a web spell or a hold person or another stun spell. You know, that said, the enemy is just going to stand in one place. It's not like Chaos where they run around and can still attack you or other characters nearby. They're literally just going to stand in place and do nothing. So overall, this is a pretty debilitating effect. It's permanent, and it's going to leave the enemy standing there just waiting to die. You can hit some high-level enemies with this if you debuff them first, of course. You know, for example, I tested this on Furkrag. Yes, you can make Furkrag in the base game. If you cast several of these things on top of a Malison, you can have one go off and have Furkrag just stand there waiting to die, which is sort of funny. So, you know, there's something to be said for this spell because it's a permanent effect and it's a nasty debuff. You know, I just keep going back to my general aversion to these spells that are single target, and if the enemy fails their save, then, or if the enemy makes their save, then the spell is gonna have been for naught to cast the spell. There's a wide variety of them, but it's difficult to justify why any of them is much different from the other, at least among the ones that are decent, right? Which is basically blindness at level 1, and then polymorph other at level 4, or Feeblemind at level 5. For all of these spells, there is a nasty effect,
But you're going to need to cast Greater Malison, lower resistance or pierce magic. If you're playing with SCS especially, you're going to need to cast like multiple Ruby Rays or a Warding Whip to take down all the enemy's spell defenses. And then finally, when the enemy is completely debuffed and naked, yes, you can hit them with this negative effect and probably still have to cast it a few times to have success with it. Of course, if you're in a position where you can unload a series of 6 or 7 debuffs at an enemy, and then the enemy's standing there naked, there's going to be lots of ways to dispatch that enemy, including with just damage spells, which are a lot more versatile and are guaranteed to do something. So, this is stylistic. I just keep coming back to the fact that for enemies that you're really going to be able to impact with this, there's a lot of prep, and it's hard to say why this effect is worse than even the level 1 blindness spell, which will actually have the same impact of making the enemy stand there and do nothing as long as you escape its field of vision. In fact, level 1 blindness, the enemy gets a -4 penalty to AC, so it's even easier to kill with ranged weapons once it's impacted by the effect. You don't get a -2 saves penalty with level 1 blindness. If you wanted that, then maybe you want to think about web instead, and stunning the enemy, so your attacks will hit guaranteed at least for a round, but you get the same -2 saves penalty, and of course that's an AoE spell. And we're talking about level 1 or 2 spells here. So, in summary, the effect of this is debilitating. It's highly stylistic whether you like to play with these single target disables. For me, especially with SCS where you have to do multiple extra debuffs to ever have one of these go off, I'd much rather just cast 1 breach or 1 remove magic and then focus on damage spells. And if I was going to try a single target disable, I would load up a couple blindnesses or some webs instead of using a valuable level 5 spell slot on this. Even Polymorph Other, I think, is higher quality than this spell because Polymorph Other, although it doesn't come with the -2 saves penalty, it has a much nastier effect in that it turns the enemy into a very low HP squirrel. So in addition to debilitating the enemy, Polymorph Other is going to remove potentially hundreds of HP at the same time. So I would go with Polymorph Other over Feeblemind every time. When you stack all these things up together, views can differ. There is a somewhat stylistic element, but given the fact that damage spells, I think, are usually preferable and the amount of debuffing you need to do to have a spell like this work against an enemy that it's worth casting against, I don't think this is an amazing spell. It's not horrible, but I'll rate it a 3 out of 10. Polymorph Other at level 4 and Blindness, I think, as well, I gave a 4 out of 10, and I think those are both better spells than this one, considering what you get at the level. So, this has to be inferior to those, I think. So a 3 out of 10 rating for Feeblemind, which is an okay spell that's still very situational or hard to justify against other spells at the level. And yeah, I think that's fair to describe Feeblemind. All right. Moving off of Feeblemind to the next spell, Hold Monster. Hold Monster is yet another enchantment / charm spell. There are quite a few of them at level 5. This spell has a duration of 1 round per level, a cast time of 5, an AoE of 1 creature and any enemies within 4 feet of it, so that's very small, and a saving throw negates. This spell holds 1d4 creatures of any type rigidly immobile and in place for 9 or more rounds, unless a saving throw verse spell is made with a -2 penalty. The effect is centered on the victim selected by the caster. Any enemies within 4 feet of the target are also affected. Those who succeed on their saving throws are totally unaffected by the spell. Undead creatures cannot be held. Held creatures cannot move or speak, but they remain aware of events around them and can use abilities not requiring motions or speech. Being held does not prevent the worsening of the subject's condition due to wounds, diseases, or poison. So this is a stun spell. I'm not really sure why this says held creatures can use abilities not requiring motion or speech. That's not true. The effect of this spell is like hold person, except it works over a wider class of enemies, and it has this little AoE aspect to it. So the effect of this is a stun, and the duration is pretty decent at 9 rounds when you get it, when you first get access to level 5 spells, plus 1 round thereafter up to a max of 20 rounds. There is this note in the spell description about the spell holding 1d4 creatures, but once again, and I've said this before, but just like with Color Spray or Hold Undead, or the other spells that have this certain number of creatures limiter, that limiter is actually not coded into the game from what I have seen. You can, if the enemies are highly clumped, you can stun more than 4 creatures with this spell. So all that matters is the AoE. That said, the AoE is really small. You're going to be lucky if you catch 2 or 3 creatures within the AoE to begin with. The hitboxes of the creatures are just so big that 4 feet can't contain too many of them to begin with in a 4-foot radius circle. This spell is party friendly, and I guess since it's a stun spell, once again, we have to compare to the reigning best stun spell in the Arcane spell book, which is still the case, even though we're all the way at level 5 now, that the reigning best stun and enemy crowd control spell, I think, in the Arcane book is still Web at level 2, which comes with a -2 saves penalty. It has a really big AoE, even though it's not party friendly, and it has a chance to stun enemies each round during the effect. All in all, it's hard to say that Hold Monster is really better than Web. It is party friendly, but the AoE is just so much smaller. And it's a one-time shot for a longer duration stun. But the thing about stuns is that you'd always much rather have the multiple opportunities to stun enemies that Web provides versus a longer stun that only has 1 shot to go off. Because stun is such a debilitating effect, it's much more valuable to have a chance to stun any enemy within the AoE for a single round than it is to have 1 shot at a longer stun. If you get enemies stunned for a single round in this game, that's going to be enough for you to cast a debuff against them and then blast them down with physical damage most of the time. That's quite powerful. So, all in all, it's hard to see how this spell is justifiable against even the level 2 Web spell. If you really want crowd control at level 5, then Chaos also is a better spell than this. It's also party friendly. It also comes with a -2 saves penalty, and it works over a much larger area of effect. The effect of it is obviously not nearly as debilitating, but you're going to have a way better shot hitting multiple enemies with Chaos than you are with this tiny AoE that you're probably only going to get 1 or 2 enemies inside. So, not a horrible spell. It does stun enemies, but just one of those extra crowd control spells that exists in the game. There's just so many varieties of spells that do extremely similar things that, differentiating them is like splitting hairs. And when one is a little bit worse because they're so similar, that makes the spell like immediately almost irrelevant. And that's sort of the case with this spell. You should either use Web at level 2 because you have a ton of those spell slots and it's a weak lower level, or if you really want crowd control at level 5, then use Chaos, which is superior to this spell. So I'll rate Hold Monster a 2 out of 10. Not really something I ever take. All right, this takes us to another one of the higher quality spells in level 5. That's Lower Resistance. Lower Resistance has a duration of 9 rounds plus 1 round per level, a cast time of 5, an AoE of 1 creature, no save, and when cast upon a target creature, this spell will lower the magic resistance of this creature by 10% plus 1% per level of the caster. There's no saving throw, and the target's magic resistance, if any, does not affect this spell. For example, if a creature has 60% MR and this spell is cast on it by a 15th level mage, then the target's magic resistance would be lowered by 25% automatically. That's the base 10% plus 1% for every level, so 25%. The effect is cumulative for each casting of the spell. If Lower Resistance was cast upon the same creature again, the creature's magic resistance would be 60%, minus 25%, minus 25%, which would leave the creature with 10% MR. This spell will last until its duration expires and cannot be dispelled. Okay, so there's sort of a new game mechanic coming into play here a little bit. This is the first spell in the Mage arsenal that can combat MR, or magic resistance. And magic resistance is everywhere, especially if you play with SCS, especially in TOB. By TOB, all of the tough enemies are going to be highly, moderately to highly magic resistant. All higher level undead throughout all of SOA and TOB are at least partially magic resistant, like mummies and skeletons. All the ball spawn are varying degrees of magic resistant. Tough enemies like the Ravager are magic resistant. Dragons all have high magic resistance. And a bunch of demons, which you'll see a ton of if you play with SCS, are highly magic resistant. And so you need to have a solution for combating magic resistance as a spellcaster. Especially if you're doing what I think is the main role of the mage in late game, which is to deal massive amounts of AoE damage. Your fantastic AoE damage spells are just not going to have a great effect if your enemies are avoiding them because they're magic resistant. And as a reminder, the way that MR works in this game is that every time there's a magic effect cast against the creature with the MR, whether it's an AoE or it's a single target, unless it's one of a select number of debuffs in the game that looks through MR, like Breach does, and the lower resistance type spells, then the creature that has the MR that's the target is going to have a chance to avoid that effect equal to whatever the MR percentage is. And it's not like a resistance where MR reduces the damage or reduces the effect by some percentage. It's just an RNG based effect where MR is either going to allow the effect through or cancel it out completely. So, we talked about that back in level 1 when talking about why Magic Missile retains utility. Well, it's because Magic Missile has 5 separate bullets at higher levels that each is going to do an individual check against MR, and thus you have a higher chance of doing some damage. Even if you're casting a big, bad, scary damage spell like Abi Delzim's or Skull Trap at high levels, that spell could do 100 damage per target, or if the target is 90% magic resistant, then 90% of the time, the spell is going to do absolutely nothing. So you need to have a way to lower enemies' magic resistance to really have your mages realize their full potential late in the saga and against tough enemies in SOA as well. So this is just, an important part of your spell book in tough fights, certainly. So let's talk about this specific spell a bit more. What it does, it lowers magic resistance by 10% plus 1% per level. And as the example in the spell description illustrates, those are in absolute points, bottoming out at 0%. So it's not like there's diminishing returns where the reduction in enemy MR is calculated as a percentage of their remaining MR. It's just points, right? So if you're level 15, you're going to reduce enemy MR by 25 points each time. So if the enemy starts with 75% MR, you need to cast this spell 3 times to take them down to 0%. And the spell does stack, as the example illustrates. The way that this is coded into the game, if you care, is that this is actually coded as an MR bonus in negative amounts. So it's like you're giving your enemies a cursed item that bonuses their MR by negative points. And the +1 per level caps out at level 20 with a penalty of -30. So to take 100% magic resistant enemies down to 10%, you would cast this 3 times. You could do it inside a sequencer or with Alacrity and Vecna and Amulet of Power. Given that this is a cast time of 5, you're going to make it instant cast with Vecna and Amulet of Power together. And I think the strength of the spell, like obviously it's useful. You're going to need to have this effect, but I think we have to think a bit strategically and talk about what your options are really to lower enemy MR throughout the entire spellbook and the entire saga. So if you don't have access to level 6 spells yet, then there's really not much to compare this to. This is the only option for lowering enemy MR as a mage. Priests do get the magic resistance spell that sets enemy MR to 50%. So that can be used to take an enemy down from 100% to 50%, but is going to do no better than that. And yeah, you can cast spells twice and take your chance that they're going to hit when enemies get to 50% MR. But against scary enemies that you're trying to dispatch reliably, you're probably going to want to do better than that. So when you first get access to level 5 spells, if you're fighting an unusually strong or magic resistant enemy in early to mid SOA, then there's really no other choice. You're going to stock some of lower resistance in your spellbook. You're going to have to. Then once you get to level 6 and beyond, a couple of other options open up to lower enemy magic resistance. Specifically, there are 3 different spells in the Arcane spellbook that have this impact. The first is this spell at level 5, lower resistance. The second spell is Pierce Magic at level 6. And Pierce Magic has a cast time of 6 and lowers magic resistance by 1% per level, up to 20% max, in addition to dispelling 1 spell protection of level 8 or lower on the target. And then there's Pierce Shield at level 8. That spell has a cast time of 8 and lowers resistance by 10%, plus 1% per level, up to a 30% max, and dispels 1 spell protection of any level. So you sort of have these 3 lowering MR debuffs that increase in spell level and increase in power and cast time as you go along. Lower resistance at level 5 lowers MR by 10% plus 1 point. Pierce Magic lowers by just 1 point per level and dispels a spell protection other than Spell Trap at level 9. And then Pierce Shield at level 8 lowers resistance the same way that the level 5 spell does, and also dispels 1 spell protection of any level. So you sort of have this menu to choose from. And obviously, if you're being strategic, you want to stock damage spells, buffs for yourself. You're not just going to randomly select different Pierce Magic or Pierce Shield and have one at every level. There's probably optimal play. You're going to pick one of these spells to go with. And, of these 3, I think either Pierce Magic or Lower Resistance, this spell at level 5, is defensible as the one to use to lower enemy MR. It sort of becomes a stylistic choice or situational choice. I think Pierce Shield at level 8 is just out because the cast time is long. Even with Vecna and Amulet of Power, it's a cast time of 3. So it's going to take up a significant portion of your time stops or improved alacrities. And it's also just challenging to give up a level 8 spell slot when you have Abi Dalzim's there, which, is really what you're teeing yourself up to be able to cast. Level 8 spell slots, there's Simulacrum, there's other great spells at level 8, but in particular, it's hard to give up that massive damage dealing potential of Abi Dalzim's for a spell that you could get the same impact out of at level 6 or level 5. Personally, although Pierce Magic at level 6 has a slightly lower impact on lowering enemies' MR than the level 5 version, I actually prefer it, and I usually end up stocking multiple Pierce Magics at level 6 instead of any lower resistances, just because the ability of removing spell protections can also be handy situationally. So Pierce Magic feels like more of a Swiss Army knife, where you can use it if you need to deal with an enemy mage's spell protections. You could use it even though you don't need the MR piece. And if you do want to reduce enemies' MR, then you can just cast multiple iterations of Pierce Shield. You're going to take down their MR more slowly than with lower resistance, but you still do a decent job of it, especially at higher levels with Pierce Magic. So I prefer Pierce Magic. I also think that since level 6 does not have any damage spells that are useful to load up the spell book with, I find it easier on most playthroughs to give up a level 6 spell for a Pierce Magic than a level 5 spell for a lower resistance, just because I do, as we'll get into, like Sunfire and some of the other buffs in level 5. Now, I'll say all this said, like, this is highly stylistic. Definitely, I can see how if you have a fighter heavy party and you want to max out improved haste at level 6, then you're always going to sacrifice level 5 spell slots and take lower resistance instead of Pierce Magic. And that'd be totally rational. So I think both lower resistance or Pierce Magic are viable options. And, anytime you have a spell that's doing something essential for you as a debuff, and there's only 2 options in the game for what spell does it, that's going to be a quality spell. So this spell, lower resistance, is a quality spell, one of the best 2 spells in this game for its purpose, and it's essential in the toughest fights in the game, especially late in the saga. So I'll rate lower resistance a 7 out of 10. Definitely a spell that you're going to be taking and using at some points in the saga. Next up is Minor Spell Turning. This is an abjuration spell with a duration of 3 rounds per level, a cast time of 5. The AoE is the caster. And I don't think I'm going to read the whole spell description. I think I'll just talk about what this does and how it works, because I can give a better overview than the spell description by just talking through it. So this is the first instance of a turning spell. This is one of the 3 types of spell protections that mages can cast on themselves. The other 2 types are spell deflection and spell trap. And both spell deflection and spell turning have a major and minor version. Or, I guess there's no major in front of the higher level version. So there's just the regular spell turning and spell deflection, which are stronger spells. And then there's weaker versions, which are the minor versions. We already talked about minor spell deflection, which came at level 3. And now we're talking about minor spell turning, which is the first spell turning spell in the game, which comes at level 5. So what does minor spell turning do? Well, minor spell deflection, for reference, came at level 3, and it affected a total of 4 spell levels and would take spells that were single target spells cast specifically at the caster that was protected by minor deflection and absorb those spells so that they had no impact on the mage. And when we say 4 spell levels, the way that it works is that if there's 1 spell level left on the minor deflection and a level 9 spell is cast at the character that's affected. I think minor deflection caps out at level 7, so I'll say a level 7 spell, like the Finger of Death. Then the spell deflection is going to absorb that spell, even though it sort of overflows. So because there's 1 level remaining, even though a level 7 spell was cast, the spell deflection will still absorb, and that last spell would eliminate the protection. Spell turning works the same way, right? So if you have 1 level of protection left on this minor spell turning spell, and somebody casts a polymorph other on you, which is a 4th level spell, then even though you only have 1 level of turning remaining, the spell turning is still going to reflect that polymorph other spell back on the caster. And at that point, the minor spell turning would go away. So that's a lot about sort of the dynamics of how this works. Of course, the major difference between minor deflection and minor turning is the difference between absorbing spells and turning them back on their original caster. Spell turning will turn the spells back on their original caster. The other major difference, which is unfavorable for minor spell turning, is that for some reason minor spell turning is capped out at only affecting spells up to level 4 spells. That's extremely limiting. There's really not even that many scary single target spells that you will face, certainly in the base game, cast against you that are level 4 or below. The things that are really scary are, Finger of Death, Disintegration, spells like that, instant kill spells that are level 6 plus spells. You're not really scared about enemy mages casting, a magic missile or a Melf's acid arrow at you by the time you get to be level 5. And you have mirror images, you have stone skins, you have, you might have a minor globe of invulnerability up. There's lots of other ways to protect yourself from those spells other than casting this minor spell turning spell. So although it is better to turn spells back at their casters, obviously, than just absorb them, this limiter that this spell only applies to up to level 4 spells, I think actually makes this spell worse than the level 3 spell deflection, minor spell deflection, which already was not a fantastic spell, just because 4 spell levels is not a lot to either absorb or reflect. So this spell is giving you something, but it's not better than the level 3 version, and generally speaking, it's not a very powerful effect. A couple other things to note here, just like the spell deflection versions, major and minor spell turning, or just regular spell turning versus this spell minor spell turning, do not stack. You can only ever have 1 up. So as soon as you get level 7 spell turning, which is only 2 spell levels away at this point, then this minor version at level 5 becomes completely obsolete. And the level 7 spell turning is way better than this level 5 version. There's a giant gap. So to begin with, even if this was a good spell, it becomes completely obsoleted within 2 spell levels. If you do recast this spell while it's still active, you do refresh the max levels of protection. It's a small side note. And then as to the sequencing of turning spells versus deflection spells and spell trap, if you have all 3 up, turning spells will always operate first, then any spell trap that you have up will operate, and then deflection. So if you did have spell turning up, you would actually block your spell trap from catching spells and refreshing your spell book. Something to think about later on when you're a level 9 plus, or you have access to level 9 plus spells. if you want to get the best use out of your spell trap, then you may just want to avoid spell turning altogether. Now we'll get to all that later, but just mentioning it now because, this is the first time we're talking about a spell turning spell. So I think to sum up, turning spells back at their casters is a nice effect. Putting a turning spell up on yourself, generally speaking, is a decent idea. It's one of the types of spell protections that you have access to, and you can stack it with spell deflection and, if you so choose, spell trap. So, having a turning spell up is not a bad thing, but the level 7 version is what you're going to want to use. This level 5 version is just not worth the level 5 spell slot, considering that it only protects you up to level 4 spells, and it only is going to turn up to 4 spells. You're much better off, if you want to be protected from level 4 spells and below, just using a minor globe at level 4 and saving your level 5 spell slot for spell shield or spell immunity, which these are the other spell protections at this level that we'll get to later on. Both of those spells are much more useful than this minor spell turning. I'm also not really sure why there's such a gap between when you get minor spell deflection and minor spell turning. Like, if this spell was accessible at level 3 or something, just like minor spell deflection, then I guess it could be worth considering as like an anti-mage solution in BG1. But to have to wait all the way to level 5 to get this thing that only affects up to level 4 enemy spells just doesn't make sense. Like, this effect of sending a few low-level spells back at the original caster is just not worth this needing to be a level 5 spell slot. So this is just not a great spell. It's not totally offensive or, horrible like some of the other spells in this level, but it's not a good spell. I'll rate this a 2 out of 10. And we'll return to the concept of spell turning in level 7 when we get to the real spell turning spell, which is much, much stronger than this. So 2 out of 10 for this minor spell turning spell. Okay, next up. Oh boy. It's the next in the series of monster summoning spells. Monster Summoning 3. All right, Monster Summoning 3 is a conjuration spell with a duration of 4 rounds plus 1 round per level, a cast time of 5. This spell is much like the 3rd level Monster Summoning 1 spell, except that this spell summons 5 HD monsters. There's a 60% chance of receiving 1 monster and a 40% chance of receiving 2 monsters. These monsters appear within spell range and attack the caster's opponents until the spell duration expires or until they are slain. Okay, it's yet another monster summoning spell. We already talked about how Monster Summoning 1 and 2 are some of the most disappointing spells and worst spells at those levels because of the extremely weak monsters that they summon and the fact that they're worse than the wand version. And Monster Summoning 3 is really not much different. This spell will summon 1 to 2 Ogre Berserkers or Ettercaps. Those are the only summons I've ever seen come out of this, and I cast it a ton of times. This is what the wiki says that the spell summons. I'm pretty sure. I didn't check the code on this, but I'm pretty sure that's all you can ever get is a level 5 Ogre Berserker or a level 5 Ettercap, and you can get 1 to 2 of them. So these are Baldur's Gate 1 level enemies that you face from early levels in like early to mid Baldur's Gate 1. They have no resistances and they do physical damage, but they're going to get shredded immediately by any type of enemy at a level where you're going to need level 5 spells to combat that enemy. And when you compare this to Animate Dead being at the same level, the lowest level skeleton that you can get from Animate Dead is way better than these summons because it's going to last for 8 hours and it has a ton of resistances that are going to help keep it alive, compared to an Ogre Berserker or an Ettercap. So there's just zero reason to ever take this over Animate Dead. Another underwhelming monster summoning spell that, will conjure some meat into the battle that'll get absolutely destroyed by magic and physical damage within a couple rounds of when you cast it. Don't take this. Take Animate Dead instead. Rate the spell a 1 out of 10 for Monster Summoning 3. Skip. Next up is Oracle. Oracle is a divination spell. It has a cast time of 5, a 120-foot radius, so basically as far as you can see. No saving throw. When cast, this spell will cancel all illusion/phantasm spells of 5th level and lower within its area of effect. The spells affected are Reflected Image, Invisibility, Mirror Image, Non-Detection, Improved Invisibility, and Shadow Door. The caster can control just whom this spell affects. Therefore, it will affect only creatures that are not in the caster's party. The area of effect is roughly a 120-foot radius around the caster. Okay. This is an anti-illusion spell. I think this is a spell that I never really took or studied before doing this guide, honestly. And once I did study it, I realized why. This is just sort of a strange spell. I'll try to talk about what I mean by that in a little bit more detail and why this sort of feels like a relic of game design, or a spell that was more useful before certain tweaks were made to the way the game works that render it almost useless. So let's talk about what this does, and to do that we have to really compare it and assess it against the other divination spells and illusion spells that are interacting with it. Obviously, the reigning best divination spell in the game up to this point is level 2 Detect Invisibility. That spell has a cast time of 2 and purges all of the same invisibility spells as this spell at level 5. So Detect Invis purges invisibility, regular way invisibility. It purges improved invisibility, and it also purges Shadow Door, which has just the same exact effect as improved invisibility. So already we're starting to see that we have some issues here, because Detect Invis is very important. That has a quick cast time to quickly bring enemies out of invisibility. That's great. Cast time of 2 instead of cast time of 5. It gets rid of all the same invisibility effects, and that's a level 2 spell slot, which is one of the weakest spell levels, instead of this very valuable level 5 spell slot. The only thing that you could say that Oracle has over Detect Invis is that Oracle is going to dispel mirror images and Reflected Image, the level 1 spell that gives enemies a single image. By the way, in the base game, I don't think there's a single enemy in the entire game that casts Reflected Image on themselves. So really, we're just talking about mirror image. And Oracle, like the level 3 spell, Detect Illusion, Oracle will work through non-detection, right? So if an enemy casts Invis on themselves and then casts non-detection, that non-detection would block the level 2 Detect Invis, but it would not block Oracle. That said, in both the base game and SCS, enemies are almost never casting, or basically never, under the effect of non-detection. So these two differences, or these two ways that Oracle is better than level 2 Detect Invis, that it gets rid of mirror image and it works through non-detection, I don't even think these are worth taking an extra 3 cast time for this spell, let alone the fact that you're giving up a level 5 spell slot versus level 2 Detect Invis. So, there's just not a justification to take this spell over level 2 Detect Invis. If you're worried, the other thing to think about is that True Sight is in this game. True Sight is the next and final power divination spell that both priests and mages get access to. And mages get access to True Sight at level 6, so only one level after this spell, and priests get access to it at level 5. Level 5 divine spellcasting is accessible to priests at only 90k more XP than mages get access to Oracle at their level 5 spell slots. So like very, very soon, whether you have priests in your party or not, which you probably do, very, very soon after you have access to Oracle, you're going to get access to True Sight. And True Sight is better in every way. It goes off every round, and it'll get rid of much stronger illusion spells than just the ones that are listed in the Oracle description here. And it'll do it all at one go, repeatedly every round. So this is a spell that right when you get it at level 5, it's already not better than the level 2 divination spell, and then immediately it becomes obsoleted by True Sight, which is coming, very soon after this spell. So there's really not a situation where this is going to be something that you need in your spell book. Now, the reason I say that this is sort of a strange spell that feels like it was obsoleted by a change in the game rules is this spell would, and Shadow Door as well, the Invis spell at this level, both Shadow Door and Oracle would make a little bit more sense if it was the case that the level 2 Detect Invis did not dispel either improved Invis or Shadow Door. If that was true, then you would see how you couldn't just rely on level 2 Detect Invis. If you're facing higher level mages that use Shadow Door or improved Invis, you would need this higher level divination spell to combat them. You would need Oracle in your spellbook in that event. But that's not how the game is coded. I'm not sure whether this is like a legacy D&D thing or whatever, or whether originally it was that way and then Detect Invis was just made stronger. But this progression between divination and illusion spells would sort of make more sense if you needed Oracle to get rid of improved Invis or Shadow Door. You don't, therefore level 2 Detect Invis is going to work across the board to get rid of enemy invisibility. Therefore, there's really no reason to ever take Oracle. That's a lot of jib-jab from me talking about theories of game design, getting into some obscure crap here in the way that divination and illusion spells work, all to get to the conclusion that Oracle is not a good spell. You should rely on Detect Invis at level 2, and then you switch to True Sight at higher levels, and there's really never any reason to take this. So I'll rate this spell a 1 out of 10. Sort of a relic of game design, leaving it as one of the most useless spells at level 5. Okay, let's take on the next spell here. It's yet another doozy, Phantom Blade. Phantom Blade has a duration of 3 rounds plus 1 round per level, a cast time of 5, a special AoE, being that it summons a magic weapon for use of the caster, and no saving throw. This spell creates a translucent, shadow-like, weightless area of magical force extending from the fingers of one of the caster's hands. The silent, blade-shaped construct's cutting edges inflict damage just as those of a real sword do. The caster wields the Phantom Blade as if proficient with it, at her normal THAC0. Already we have problems, or we sense what the problems are going to be. The Phantom Blade acts as a +3 magical sword in terms of to hit and damage bonuses, as well as the type of creatures it can hit. However, due to its etheric nature, it causes an extra +10 damage against undead creatures. This sword can only be used by the caster and remains in her hand for the duration of the spell or until dispelled. Okay, so it's sort of like similar to the touch spells that we saw at earlier levels, this spell is going to conjure up a magical weapon for your mage to fight with. And what is the weapon? Well, the weapon does 1d10 plus 3 damage, and it's a plus 3. It's a plus 3 weapon for determining what it can hit, and it gives you a plus 3 Thaco bonus, like the description suggests. So this thing is exactly the same as a plus 3 katana that does plus 10 damage against undead. That if there was a katana in the game that worked that was plus 3 and had that bonus versus undead, it would be exactly the same as this summoned weapon. Proficiencies aside, I'll get to that in a second. It's not like this is katana weapon proficiency when you summon this thing. So you can dual wield with this. If this always goes in your main hand and replaces your main hand weapon, you can put something in your offhand. Overall, what is there to say about this? It's a level 5 spell that creates a plus 3 melee weapon for your mage for maybe a couple of battles, given that it's 3 rounds plus 1 round per level. This is overall very useless, so since you're still going to be left with your mage APR of 1 attack per round, regardless your level, and your crappy mage Thaco. A plus 3 enchantment's not bad, but by the time you get access to level 5 spells, you're going to have several options for plus 3 weapons, even if you're still in BG1. You can buy a plus 3 staff from Olgoth's Beard from level 1, for example. And certainly, by the time you get to SOA, there are plus 3 weapons all over the place that your mage can wield. So just having a plus 3 enchantment is really nothing special. And probably your main hand weapon, if you're a mage, is going to have some useful defensive buffs or other stats on it that are going to immediately go away when you cast this spell and get rid of it. So, you're not trying to melee as a mage, like pure and simple. Unless a spell is going to both give you a magical weapon and give you a ton of combat buffs, like extra APR or fighter like Thaco, then it's just not going to make any sense to cast. Like you're going to still be left with 1 APR and horrible Thaco, and a plus 3 enchantment is not going to change that. So this doesn't make sense. The thing that's extra painful about this spell is that, okay, you might be thinking, all right, you're talking about pure mage, but like, what about like a fighter mage, either multi or dual class? Couldn't you cast this as a fighter mage and then run into battle, and maybe it's good against undead? Maybe you get access to this a little bit before you have access to a plus 3 longsword, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Okay, no, you can't actually do that. You do not want to do that. The main reason is that the Phantom Blade, although it looks like a longsword and it does 1d10 plus 3 damage like a katana, the proficiency type that's coded into the game for this weapon is actually none. So if you're fully, grandmaster, if you have grand mastery or a bunch of weapon pips in longsword or whatever, they're going to have no effect as soon as this thing is cast into your hand. You cannot get extra APR on this magical weapon because its weapon specialization type is none. There's nothing. It's not something you can put pips in. That means there's really never any reason to cast this as a fighter mage either. You're actually going to debuff yourself versus just wielding your regular plus 1 or plus 2 longsword that you have proficiencies in if you are a longsword user. Unfortunately, it's a magical weapon that's not even useful for a fighter mage, which theoretically would be the best character in the game to be using a conjured magical weapon. Overall, not a spell that there's any use case for, especially when you compare this to some of the other awesome spells at this level, to have your mage actually, act like a magic user and do damage or protect himself or herself. Just summoning a plus 3 magical weapon to attack once per round with is garbage. They could have done something interesting with this, like make it a longsword proficiency, maybe add some magic damage, make it add to APR or something like that, but none of that was done, and as a result, we have a pointless spell. That's a super weak spell, something that you never want to take. And I'll rate Phantom Blade a 1 out of 10.
Okay, let's keep going on to some slightly better spells here. Next up is Protection from Acid. Protection from Acid is an abjuration spell. It has a duration of 1 turn, so 10 rounds per level, a cast time of 6, AoE of 1 creature, and no save given it's a buff. When the spell is cast, it confers complete invulnerability to all acid-based attacks, whether magical or non-magical, such as Acid Arrow or a creature's special attacks. This effect lasts for the duration of the spell or until dispelled. All right, pretty straightforward. We had the first resistance spells in the game in the Arcane book in level 3 when we saw protection from cold and protection from fire. And now, for whatever reason, we have to wait until level 5 to get these 2 other elemental protection spells against acid and electricity damage, which are the other 2 types of elemental damage in the game. I talked a lot at level 3 about why resistances are really important, particularly as you get later on in the game. The main reason being that aside from minor and major globe, which have their own limitations, and spell immunity, resistances are the only way to protect yourself against nasty AoE damage effects like lightning bolt, fireball, Sunfire, Albedelzeems once you get protection from magical energy at level 6, and so forth. Spell protections like spell turning, spell deflection, spell trap will not protect you against AoE damage, and there's an added bonus that these resistances will also protect you against elemental damage that comes along with enemy attacks, like the plus fire damage when a fire elemental is hitting you and so forth. So resistances are good. There's no resistance spell in the game that I'm ever going to say is one of the worst spells in the game. Generally speaking, resistances are good. This one in particular, protection from acid, it just has to be the weakest of all the resistance spells in the Arcane book, though, just because acid damage is very rare in Baldur's Gate, and especially in the base game. So this spell has a nice duration, just like protection from fire and protection from cold, the same duration of 1 turn per level. So you're pretty much casting it once per day. But the use cases are just much more limited. I think you can sort of tell when the spell description even sort of struggles to come up with multiple examples of acid damage. It just says acid arrow or a creature's special attacks. I think Ankegs do acid damage, maybe a few other enemies, but very rare, very few and far between. And another important thing to consider is that unlike lightning bolt and fireball, there's no nasty traps that do acid damage, especially in the base game. In SCS with Icewind Dale spells, there's some more acid damage spells that are added, like Vitriolic Sphere, that enemy mages do use, but none of that is present in the base game, and even those in SCS are pretty rare. So on the whole, it's going to be impossible to say that this is better than protection from fire, or protection from cold, or protection from electricity, which are all the other resistance spells, just because it's so rare that you need to protect yourself against acid damage. The main example of acid damage that you'll encounter that you might want to counter with this spell would be Melf's Acid Arrow, the level 2 spell that in the base game, like pretty much every mage in BG1 likes to cast against you. But there are other ways to deal with that, other than using up a level 5 spell slot to protect yourself against a level 2 spell. Minor Globe of Invulnerability protects you against Acid Arrow, and Mirror Image does a pretty dang good job too, because
the way that Acid Arrow interacts with Mirror Image is that if the initial arrow hits one of your images, then the whole Acid Arrow spell is nullified and you'll never be under the effect and never take damage over multiple rounds. So you have other ways to protect yourself against Acid Arrow. Later on in the game, a higher level mage doesn't really need to worry about level 2 enemy spells anyway, but later on in the game, because Acid Arrow is a single target spell, your spell deflection and spell turning would also protect you from Acid Arrow. So this is the most common type of acid damage in the game. It's not that scary, and there's lots of different ways to protect yourself against it instead of casting this spell. I already mentioned there's no traps that do acid damage. I think in Siege of Dragonspear there is, in one of the caves, an acid dragon that does acid damage. So theoretically, if you're playing SOD, this spell could be situationally useful then for that one fight. You got to also consider, though, there are protection from acid scrolls around that give you 50% resistance. And then at later levels, we'll get to this when we talk about level 7, but later on, you're going to get access to protection from the elements that will get you 75% resistance to all 4 elemental types, including acid. And it's hard to say that you ever really truly need 100% acid resistance. Acid just, again, isn't a damage type where, there are super scary spells or effects that if you don't have absolutely 100% resistance, you're going to feel vulnerable. There is no protection from acid in the Divine Spellbook. I don't know why. That makes no sense to me. So that does mean that this spell is the one source in the game for a one-stop solution to 100% acid resistance. So you can say that for it, and it's worth noting. But I just keep coming back to the extreme lack of this type of damage in the game, and especially the base game. So when it comes to rating, I rated Protection from Cold a 3 out of 10 spell, given the rarity of cold damage, and acid damage is even rarer than cold damage. Plus, this is a level 5 spell, which is incrementally more valuable than a level 3 spell that you would need to take protection from cold. So I'm going to rate this spell a 2 out of 10. I honestly don't think I've ever cast this spell in either the base game or SCS. Acid damage is just that rare. I've never felt the need to give up a spell slot for it, even if I knew I was fighting an Ankeg or something. So 2 out of 10 for protection from acid. Next up is protection from electricity. This spell, I won't go through the whole thing. It works exactly the same as protection from acid. For some reason, the cast time is 1 shorter, a cast time of 5, whereas protection from acid has a cast time of 6. No idea why. Still the same nice long duration of 1 turn per level of all these protection spells. And this will give you 100% lightning resistance. Now, this is a bit more useful resistance spell. For one reason, Lightning Bolt. It's right there in the description. Lightning Bolt is a really scary spell in BG1 and through Baldur's Gate 2. It appears in a lot of traps. Enemy mages love to cast it on your party right from Silky in Baragost. And you know how those bolts work. Whenever the player character casts them or you cast them out of your party, they seem to just hit one character and then fly off into the ether. Whenever a lightning bolt is cast against my party by an enemy mage, it just seems to find the tiniest corner to bounce back and forth and do 200 damage. So lightning bolt is a scary spell. It's difficult to remember all the places where lightning traps are. And when a lightning trap goes off over your party inside one of those tiny narrow hallways, like in the island that you go to in Tales of the Sword Coast to pick up the cloak, or in like Firewine Ruins or something, that's scary. That's very scary. And this spell can help counter that. So this is a pretty decent spell. I think the major difference, though, on protection from electricity versus some of these other arcane protection spells is that there just are a lot more alternatives to creating electrical resistance on your party, even from early levels instead of this spell. So a primary one is a potion of absorption. You can buy them at high hedge. They're pretty common throughout BG1. That spell gives you 100% electrical resistance for 10 turns. So that's equivalent to casting this spell as a level 10 mage from one potion that's 400 GP about. As a kicker, of course, the absorption potion gives a huge AC bonus versus crushing, so it's useful for that too. And there's also a high quality divine equivalent here. The divine equivalent lasts 5 rounds per level, so half the duration, but that's still a long time. And the divine spell is at the level 4 spell level, which I think is one of the weaker divine spell levels. And so sort of a wasteland where you could afford to take a few different protection from electricities on your clerics. I always would do that, or if I'm playing a cleric mage and I want protection from electricity, I'll usually stock one on the divine side. Divine level 4 spell is just worth way less than an arcane level 5 spell. Especially considering the dynamic that like electricity damage and lightning bolt is scariest in BG1, but you only have a couple level 5 spell slots in BG1, and you need to reserve those for your hardest hitting, most important spells. Like you might stock a Cloudkill if you're fighting a bunch of mages. More likely you're going to choose an Animate Dead. That's what I do. And that skeleton is going to give you a lot more than using up a level 5 spell slot for protection from electricity, when you could instead chug a potion, use Minor Globe, or use the divine spell. On the divine alternative, it's also worth noting divine level 4 divine spells are going to be available to you from level 7 as a divine caster, which is only at 55,000 experience points, whereas you need to get to 135,000 experience to unlock level 5 spells as a mage. So you're going to get the divine version way earlier and have access to more of it than this level 5 arcane version. So this is a good spell. Like, you could probably argue that this spell should be a 4 or 5 out of 10. If there were no alternatives, I would probably rate this a 5 out of 10 just for how scary Lightning Bolt is. But you have Minor Globe, you have all these potions, you have the better divine version, and considering all those things, I just don't find myself taking protection from electricity out of the arcane book very much at all. And I'll rate this spell a 3 out of 10. This is by no means a bad spell. Just in practice, I find that I'm using other sources to get the effect that it grants. Okay, so those are the 2 resistance spells in level 5. Not bad spells, but just outshined by alternatives at this level, and not dealing with damage types that you're going to see all over the place, especially the acid one. Let's keep going. Now we move on to protection from normal weapons. Protection from normal weapons is an abjuration spell. It lasts 1 round per level. It has a quick cast time of 2, only affects the caster, no saving throw given it's a buff. When the spell is cast, it confers complete invulnerability to all non-magical weapons. This does not include weapons that are blessed or enchanted. The spell may not be cast on someone who is protected from magical weapons. The effect lasts for the duration of the spell or until dispelled. That's an interesting sentence in there about how it may not be cast on someone who's protected from magical weapons. I did not test that. So maybe when I record the video over this, I'll test that and see if that's actually true. That feels like one of those game dynamics that it's written in the description, but you're not really sure if it's true. It's sort of irrelevant anyway. This is not a good spell. I think the issue is, by the time you get access to this, you're a level 9 caster. You're towards the very end of BG1. Maybe you're already in SOA.
And by that time, all the monsters that are attacking you have innate magical weapons, and the humanoids that are attacking you are equipped with magical weapons as well. So by the time you get access to this spell, the enemies you're facing are not trying to hurt you with the thing this protects you against, which is normal weapons. Sure, you might, as a level 9 party, run into some bandits or hobgoblins or what have you. But those enemies just stop scaring you. An enemy that uses a normal weapon, by definition, is not an enemy that is going to scare you by the time you have access to level 5 magic. Just walk up to it with your mirror image and your stone skin up, so you're completely invulnerable anyway to its damage, and use your level 5 slot to roast it in one shot with the Sunfire. Don't be messing around with protecting one mage in your party from normal arrows with this spell, or a normal bastard sword on a hobgoblin. It kind of this spell kind of reminds me, like, if you just didn't know anything about the game and you were looking at this spell description, especially if you were just starting out the game and you didn't know how enemies scaled, or the fact that almost all creatures attack with magical weapons in the game, you would look at this and be like, oh my god, this is going to make me into a god. You're telling me I can be completely immune for up to 20 rounds to normal weapons? Wow, everybody in this game has a normal weapon. Well, that's just because you haven't been outside Candlekeep and you have no idea what actual enemies you encounter. As, of course, the game makes it such that as soon as you get access to the spell, by that point, all the enemies you're facing have magical weapons. It's very similar to the dynamic that I felt at first when I went through the Hell Trials at the end of BG2, and one of the eyes grants the player character immunity to magical weapons of +1 enchantment and immunity to normal weapons. And when that occurs, like in that innate immunity, the reaction is, wow, I am a god now. Immunity to normal weapons and +1. This is super powerful. I can destroy everybody. Then you get to TOB, and like the lowest level enemy in TOB, that's like an 800 XP enemy, just a grunt with no resistances or anything. All of them are suddenly walking around with +2 axes for no reason. The only reason that the game works that way is because the game knows that you have access to that protection as of the end of BG2, and so it's going to ramp up the difficulty immediately thereafter. And the game is exactly the same way with this spell. Like, yeah, you get protection from normal weapons. By that time, all of a sudden, it's no coincidence. Every damn enemy is suddenly showing up with +1 or +2 arrows, etc. So if you take this spell, you're sort of just getting punked by the engine. Stone Skin and Mirror Image are always better. They give you the same protection that this would give you, but they also protect you against magical enemies. What else is there to say? Something that in the abstract sounds good. In practice, it's pointless, useless, doesn't have a use case. I'll rate this spell a 1 out of 10 for protection from normal weapons. Next spell, Shadow Door. And we're almost through. This level started strong with Breach and Animate Dead, and it's going to finish strong. But we have one more, middling to dud spell to get through here, which is Shadow Door. Shadow Door has a duration of 9 rounds, plus 1 round per level after the 9th level. A cast time of 2. The AoE is only the caster, so you can't cast this on others. By means of this spell, the wizard creates the illusion of a door. The illusion also permits the wizard to appear to step through this door and disappear. In reality, she has darted aside and can flee, totally invisible as per the improved invisibility spell for the spell's duration. A true seeing spell, a gem of seeing, or similar magical means can reveal the wizard. So what is this? Why does it exist? I think that this is another, this is sort of the counterpart to Oracle at level 5.
It's a illusion or divination spell that seems like it would have had a purpose if the game was coded slightly differently, but given that it's not coded that way, it's hard to understand the purpose of this spell. And the reason this sort of makes no sense is that the effect of this spell is exactly the same as improved invisibility. You get this cool door animation, but I think in the old game, it actually did look like a literal door with a domed or arched roof that you stepped into. In more recent versions, it's this sort of teleport portal that opens up. You get that animation, but the effect is exactly the same as improved invisibility. It gives you the same +4 to saves and the same effective AC bonus as improved invisibility. Now, improved invisibility is a good spell. Like that's a quality spell. Big effective AC bonus of 4. The +4 bonus to saves is huge. But spell level 4 is a weaker spell level than spell level 5. So why give up a level 5 spell slot that could be spent on lower resistance, spell shield, spell immunity, animate dead, these extra powerful spells that you get at level 5 to just do something that you could do with improved invis at level 4. Shadow Door does cast more quickly with a cast time of 2, but that's irrelevant if you have Vecna. If you have Vecna, then improved invis is also instant cast. And if you're really focused on speed of becoming invisible to protect yourself very quickly or get out of a sticky situation, then usually an invis potion is going to be what you rely on. Certainly, before you get access to Robe of Vecna or Amulet of Power, and there's still a chance you can get interrupted, even inside a cast time of 2, I would much rather pop an invis potion that can't be interrupted than try to cast Shadow Door. So, in sum, it's sort of hard to understand why this spell exists, given that it does the exact same thing as improved invis. I think that there's sort of a hint in this. This is just my speculation, but there's sort of a hint in the spell description which says that a true seeing spell or a gem of seeing, which doesn't exist in the game, or similar magical means can reveal the wizard. Well, if it was true that Shadow Door could only be dispelled by, for example, Oracle or True Sight, those higher level divination spells, then this spell would have something to be said for it. Because, let's say that it can't be purged with Detect Invis at level 2. Then you might use this to stay invisible for longer against lower level mages that don't have access to Oracle or True Sight. But again, that's not how the game works. Detect Invis at level 2 will dispel Shadow Door just like it'll dispel improved Invis. So this description that suggests that only True Seeing will get rid of this is not accurate. And that leads us back to the same conclusion. There's no way in which this is better than improved invisibility. So just take improved invisibility. Don't be taking Shadow Door. Ultimately, I rate this spell a 2 out of 10. The effects of improved invis are good, but just take it at level 4. So not a reason to take this spell. 2 out of 10 rating for Shadow Door. Next spell, and this is going to be a longer description given the complexities of this spell. The next spell is Spell Immunity. Spell Immunity has a duration of 1 round per level, a cast time of 5, AoE of the caster only, so cannot cast this on party members or other characters. No save given it's a buff. Casting this spell grants the wizard protection from 1 spell school of her choice. After the spell is cast, the wizard must choose the school she wishes to be protected from. All spells of this school will not be able to harm or aid the caster for the duration of this spell. This includes all spells from this school, including any priest spells that might benefit the caster. Okay, the spell description makes this seem pretty simple. You cast the spell, You choose a spell school, and then all spells of this school will not be able to harm or aid the caster for the duration of this spell. Right? That seems pretty straightforward. Okay, it's actually not. Like, this spell description is one that is still not very accurate in describing the nuances of how this spell works. There are lots of funny exceptions and strange rules about how spell immunity actually works in the base game. Some of those exceptions and rules change with SCS, but I'm talking about base game here, and I'll focus on that. And so I'm going to go through those special rules to try to break down what spell immunity really does for you. So, what does this protect you against? So, I think the place to start is just the real world, practical effects that you might want to cast this as a protection against. First, let's talk about divination spells. That's an obvious use case that jumps to mind. Hey, can I go invisible and then cast spell immunity divination and keep my invisibility up? The answer to that question is yes. If you are invisible or improved invisible, and then you cast spell immunity divination, that is going to allow you to keep your invisibility or your improved invisibility up, even if enemies are casting True Sight, Oracle, etc. So that'll avoid you being able to be targeted by enemy spells. Enemy single target spells, that is. So that's pretty cool. That's a definite use case. It's much stronger than non-detection, because non-detection is going to be purged by Detect Illusion or True Sight, which are the most common. True Sight is the most common way that higher level mages will try to get rid of your illusions anyway. So spell immunity divination can be useful for that purpose. That sounds cool. It's less useful than you'd think, I find, in practice, just because for so many high-level enemies, it's hard-coded into the game that they can see you even if you're invisible. And apparently this works for spellcasting as well, at least for some enemies. I tested this out, and I watched a Lich cast Finger of Death on me while improved invisibility was up with spell immunity divination. The spell immunity divination did block the True Sight from purging the improved invis, but the Lich, for whatever reason, could see through it and cast single target spells against me. And for very difficult enemies like ball spawns, dragons, Demogorgon, even in the base game, most or all of those enemies just can see through invis. So yes, against some weaker enemies, casting improved invis and then spell immunity divination is a cool way to protect yourself, but it only works against single target spells, and for that purpose you could just as equally use things like spell turning and spell deflection to protect yourself. So that's one practical use case to talk about. It's one that's reasonable, but probably not the best use case for this spell. The second thing that this spell does protect you against, and is a use case, and this one is a much more important one, is that this spell protects you against AoE damage and other AoE effects in the selected spell school, but only if those spells are cast by a caster other than the mage who cast the spell immunity on himself or herself. So, to say it again, spell immunity will protect you from spells, AoE spells cast against you in the spell school selected, unless you yourself cast those spells. So, as an example, spell immunity necromancy will not protect you against getting hit by your own skull traps. That's again why there was some value to Minor Globe at level 4, which does have that effect of protecting you from your own spells, and it's why resistances are important, because resistances will protect you from your own damage spells. But generally speaking, this is still extremely useful to be able to protect yourself against AoE effects that are cast by other casters, and we'll get into some specific examples of why. First, I'll note again that the game's spell protection spells like spell deflection, spell turning, spell trap do not work to protect you against AoE spells. To protect yourself against AoE spells, you need resistances or you need spell immunity. Resistances, those spells generally have longer durations and they'll protect you against weapon damage as well, etc. So resistances are the better long-term solution. But sometimes if you're debuffed, like if you just got hit by a breach spell or you don't have the right resistances up, that can be where spell immunity can totally save your ass. And spell immunity and the minor and major globes are the only spell protections that work against AoE damage. Note also that AoE damage spells go through and ignore mirror image. So spell immunity definitely has a place as an oh shit button. There's an Abby Dalzim's Horrid Wilting heading straight at me, and I just got dispelled. And unless I get spell immunity necromancy up, I'm going to die. An added reason why spell immunity is a great oh shit button against AoE and single target spells is that this spell has automatic improved alacrity or intro round casting built into it. Because the mechanic of the spell is that it triggers a menu from which you can select the school that you want to be immune to, the way this spell works is that you can start casting it at any time during a round, even if you've already cast the spell that round. So if you just cast a magic missile and then immediately after that you see that there's an Abby Dalzim's coming towards you and you're naked and you're going to die if you wait till the next round to cast like protection from magical energy, well, spell immunity might be the only way to save yourself because you can immediately in the middle of the round click the spell immunity icon or press the hotkey, then select spell immunity necromancy, and then within the cast time of 5, which by the way is instant with Vecna and Amulet of Power, spell immunity will go up on your character. So you can see how that has a lot of versatility and power defensively, especially with Vecna and Amulet of Power. This spell becomes instant cast at any time in the game, even if you already cast a spell in the round, by a mage wearing Vecna and Amulet of Power, because Vecna reduces spell casting time by 4, Amulet of Power by an incremental 1, and that takes you to 0. Pretty awesome. So this is at higher levels, maybe towards the end of BG1 when skeletons, or beginning BG2 when skeletons are super powerful, and physical damage still rules the day. I'm taking Animate Dead in all my level 5 spell slots, but pretty quickly you want to have at least one spell immunity available on all your Arcane casters at all times, just because of that dynamic of it being a great oh shit button. I've definitely been in situations before where something is coming at me, whether it's an AoE or nasty single target effect, and I'm like tabbing out of the game and Googling what spell school it is so that I can cast spell immunity during the round. All right, that's not very role play-ish, is it? Like the ball spawn is not whipping out Google mid round and then figuring out what spell to cast. But that's the way to maximize use of this spell. Okay, so I've covered now how spell immunity, one use case is for spell immunity divination to keep your invis up. Next use case, much more important one, to protect yourself against AoE damage and other AoE effects cast by other casters. And I've talked about damage effects. Another AoE effect that spell immunity protects you from is dispel and remove magic if you cast spell immunity abjuration on yourself. This, in my view, this is the single most important use of this spell, especially as you get to later levels, because spell immunity abjuration is the only way in the game to protect yourself against dispel or remove magic. Whether you're in SCS or the base game, enemies will try to use dispel or remove magic on you a lot, even more than breach or other debuffs. And if you're hit by one of those spells as a magic user, you're immediately in huge trouble because your stone skin is immediately going down. all of your resistances are immediately going down. So a single AoE damage spell or a fighter, an enemy fighter being nearby, is going to kill you very quickly if you get hit by a dispel or remove magic. And spell immunity abjuration is the only way in the game to protect yourself against that. So this becomes pretty essential when you get to higher level fights, when you're going against spellcasters in late BG2 or in TOB.
Note that just like with area of effect damage spells, there is this quirk that spell immunity abjuration will not protect you against dispel magic that you cast on yourself. But that's not that much of a disadvantage, considering that it's easy to just use the party-friendly version, remove magic, if you would be inside the AoE. And if you're a mage that has a high-level divine caster also in your party, who is going to be one of your sources of debuffing, because that cleric has a high level, so that cleric's dispel magic is quite powerful. Well, that cleric, because it's not you, although it's a friendly character, that cleric can freely cast dispel magic into a battle in an area where you would be caught as the mage. And spell immunity abjuration will protect you against being dispelled by that priest spell, simply because it was not you as the caster who cast it. So the fact that spell immunity abjuration is not going to protect you against your own dispel magics is really not a big deal, considering remove magic, and still means that this aspect of spell immunity, i.e. being able to protect yourself against dispel and remove magic cast by enemy casters and other casters in your own party, is hugely useful. One other quick note on using this to keep your buffs up.
In the base game, as I said earlier when we talked about Breach, for whatever reason, spell immunity abjuration, even though Breach is an abjuration spell, does not protect you against Breach. So although this is still great to keep your protections up because it guards you against dispel or remove magic in the base game, Breach can still get you. In SCS, spell immunity abjuration will also protect you against Breach. So in SCS, like, spell immunity abjuration is amazing. Spell immunity abjuration is one of the best protections you can cast on yourself. In the base game, it's a little bit less strong, but it's still very strong, especially because in the base game, the way the AI works for enemy mages, they'll rarely try to hit you with a breach for whatever reason. Enemy spellcasters just love to use dispel and remove magic on you instead. So, very important, spell immunity abjuration. That's the best of the options, generally speaking, for spell immunity. And going into big fights against spellcasters in BG2 and TOB, I'm always having that up on as much of my party as possible. Okay, the last thing, we talked about divination, we talked about AoE effects, and then the last thing that spell immunity protects you against, and this one's maybe the most obvious one, is single target spells in the selected spell school. Now, it's not quite that simple, so I'm going to give the complete explanation, and this is just me writing crap out based on testing it out. The actual truth is that spell immunity will protect you against single target spells in the selected spell school, except if they're cast by the mage, the mage himself, who's putting the spell immunity on, or the spell is breach, or the spell is an anti-spell spell like Ruby Ray, Kelbin's Warding Whip, Spell Strike, etc. So let me break that down a bit more. First of all, spell immunity, when it comes to single target spells, spell immunity will not block single target spells that you cast on yourself, like the mage, the same character cast on himself. This, theoretically, if you put spell immunity necromancy on and then you cast a Finger of Death on yourself, no protection. Now, the reason that that's still good is obviously you're not going to cast nasty single target spells on yourself, and you want to still be able to buff yourself, right? So if you're, I'm trying to think of a single target buff. I mean, I'm not sure the illusion spells even work this way, but like mirror image. If you cast spell immunity illusion, you can still cast mirror image or improved invisibility on yourself. So there's an exception written in here so that you can have spell immunity up and still be able to buff yourself. Somebody else in your party is not going to be able to walk over and buff you with the spell once you do this, but you can still buff yourself. So that's good. And then the other exceptions are Breach. I already talked about that. Again, in the base game, Breach just ignores spell immunity abjuration. I don't know why. It doesn't make total sense. That's just the way it's coded. And then the last category that spell immunity will not protect you against, and this actually makes sense, of single target spells, is anti-spell spells, right? There's a series of spells in this game, starting with Spell Thrust, going up through Ruby Ray, Kelvin's Warding Whip, Spell Strike, Pierce Magic, and Pierce Shield have this effect that strip away spell protections. And spell immunity counts as a spell protection. So, of course, those spells that counter spell protections can't be blocked by the spell immunity itself. Otherwise, there'd be no way to ever eliminate spell immunity. So, those spells, which are all single target spells, will strip spell immunity, and spell immunity does not block them. You can't cast spell immunity. I think all those are abjuration spells. You can't cast spell immunity abjuration, and then when a Ruby Ray is cast against you, you get to keep all your spell protections up, including the immunity. No. That makes sense, but just completing the rule set. Okay, so let's recap. Here is what spell immunity protects you against. Spell immunity divination does protect you against enemy, true sight, oracle, etc. spells, divination spells that would otherwise purge your illusions and your invisibility.
Spell immunity also protects the caster against AoE damage and other effects, unless those AoE damage or other effects are cast by the same caster who casts spell immunity on himself. And this includes Dispel and Remove Magic, which is very important because in the base game, that's the only way to protect yourself against Dispel and Remove Magic. And finally, spell immunity protects you against single target spells in the selected spell school, except if they're cast by the mage that casts spell immunity, or their breach, or their anti-spell spells. Okay, got it? It sort of makes sense. It is extra complex. If you have mods, tweaking this spell is one thing that mods commonly do. So like SCS is an example with how it tweaks breach. So in different installs, this can vary slightly, but in base game, based on all the testing I've done, this is how this works. Okay, that's what spell immunity protects you against. The flip side of that, just to highlight again a few things that spell immunity does not protect you against. Like this is the inverse of what I was just saying, but just to put a finer point on it, it doesn't protect you against single target spells or AoE spells you cast on yourself.
So mostly that's relevant, so you can still cast buffs. It does not protect you against breach, dumb, fixed in SCS, but we're talking base game, and does not protect you against anti-spell spells. To protect yourself against anti-spell spells like Ruby Ray, Spell Thrust, Kelvin's Warding Whip, Spell Strike, etc., for those you need Spell Shield, which we're going to talk about later as the next spell. But spell immunity will not protect you. So to wrap all this up, there are a lot of quirks to the way that this spell works when you really dig down. But what we're left with is a few important use cases that make this spell good. The first one is, as I mentioned, a quick oh shit button if you're naked to protect yourself against an incoming nasty spell. This is great because it's instant cast with Amulet of Power and Vecna, and there's lots of use cases where you want to have this up to protect yourself if you've been dispelled and you're naked. You can use it to protect yourself against a Finger of Death, a Disintegration, a Skull Trap, an Albi Dilzeems, a Wail of the Banshee. If necromancy, spell immunity necromancy is one of the greater the better ones to select for those situations. You can use it to protect yourself against insect plague by casting spell immunity conjuration. That's another nasty one that you might want to avoid. So that's one use case. The second important thing is again protection against dispel and remove magic. Spell immunity abjuration, which is the most common type of spell immunity you'll end up casting on yourself, is the only way in the entire game to protect yourself against these spells that will make you naked and dead as a mage. So like if that was all this did, spell immunity abjuration, if it didn't have the automatic alacrity / aura cleansing, and you could only ever protect yourself against dispel and remove magic, and this spell was just called like dispel and remove magic immunity, that by itself would still be an amazing spell. But that's just one of the situational uses. And then the third thing that you can do, which is much, much less important and much more situational, is you could use spell immunity divination to keep your illusion spells up despite facing divination spells against you. Okay. That's the whole description of the spell immunity spell. On the whole, this spell is awesome. You don't need a ton of instances of it, especially later in the game if you're refreshing your spell book with Wish, and you're going to get 20 rounds out of this later in the game, so it's going to last through the entirety of longer fights. You don't need a ton of instances of this, but I'm always taking 1 to 3 of these on my mages at all times. The counter to dispel remove magic is awesome. The oh shit button is awesome. The instant cast with AOP and Vecna is awesome. This is a top tier spell for me, one of the best spells of level 5. You can do without it, especially in the base game where there's less strategy around spell casting. Enemy mages are a little less scary. You can do without this. In SCS, this spell just becomes even more awesome. So in SCS, this might be a 10 out of 10 spell for me, but in base game, it's just a very high quality spell. Good spell, a lot of versatility, a lot of use throughout the saga. So I'll rate spell immunity a 9 out of 10. Great spell. All right. We got 2 spells left in level 5, and they're both quality spells. Okay, next up is Spell Shield. Spell Shield, yet another abjuration spell. So many abjuration spells in level 5, and many of them are good. Spell Shield has a duration of 3 rounds per level, a cast time of 8. AoE is the caster, no save given it's a buff. When this spell is cast, the wizard is protected from the next magical attack against her. The spells from which the wizard is protected are Spell Thrust, Secret Word, Breach, Lower Resistance, Pierce Magic, Ruby Ray, Calbin's Warding Whip, Pierce Shield, and Spell Strike. If one of these spells is cast at the wizard, this spell activates and absorbs the attack. However, this only works once and the spell is consumed in the process. Otherwise, it will last for its duration. Okay, so this is sort of like a meta spell shield. It's a protection for your protections, and it's single use. It's sort of like this saran wrap coating that the first thing that hits it will make it pop off or puncture and go away. But it's the only way in the game to protect yourself against all of the spells that are listed on this list. Because as I mentioned, spell immunity abjuration will not protect you against these, including breach. So spell shield is the one way in the game to protect you against these anti-spell protection spells. There isn't like a better version of this at level 6, 7, 8, or 9. Level 5 spell shield is just what you get. Already, just based on that alone, this spell having a unique use in the game that you don't get any alternative to, you already know that this is going to be a good spell. It has a pretty decent duration at 3 rounds per level. That's 27 rounds when you first get it. So that's 3 turns or 2.7 in real life minutes. And then you get scaling up to 60 rounds at once you get to level 20 or above, which is very decent duration. That's 6 in real life minutes. That's an entire dungeon area, maybe, if it's not too long. That's several different fights. This is not something that you need to cast every time. Probably the reason that you're needing to recast this is because it actually did its job and protected you against a magical attack coming at you versus the duration running out. Now, when you first get this spell, it's impossible to really justify it over other things that you have access to at the level, like Animate Dead, Sunfire, even a Breach, just because when you're a level 9 or 10 mage, you don't have a ton of spell protections that you need this up to preserve, right? It's nice that it counters Breach, which would get rid of your stone skins and mirror images, but again, in the base game, enemy spellcasters don't really use Breach all that often. So early on, through mid SOA, this isn't a super useful spell, but by the time you get to late game and you're layering a ton of spell protections on yourself, to maximize the tankiness of your mage and take advantage of the full range of the Arcane spellbook, you're going to want to have, for every tough fight, a spell deflection up, a spell turning up, maybe 1 or even 2 spell immunities up. And by the time you layer all of those protections, it almost becomes essential to have a spell shield on top of that, because otherwise the first anti-magic attack that comes at you is going to start eating into those protections. And if it's a warding whip or a spell strike, it's going to get rid of all of them in one go or over a short period of time, unless you block the attack with spell shield. So what you end up with is one level 5 spell slot that can protect all of your buffs that you took a level 6, a level 7, a level 9 spell slot to put on yourself. So, it's sort of like, why not? Why not layer this additional protection to keep all of these anti-spell spells up on your mage that you invested so much in casting on yourself? And as I said before, there's no alternative. Spell immunity doesn't work because the anti-spell spells go around and instead attack and dispel spell immunity, even spell immunity abjuration, instead of being repelled by it. So this is the only way to protect yourself against those anti-spell spells, and that just means that it's going to be inherently strong. There's very, very few spells in this game that are the only way to do something, and whenever you identify that, it has to be a pretty decent spell at least. So Spell Shield, it's a spell that I'm usually taking at least a single cast of by mid to late BG2 and all the way through TOB. It makes mages very hard to it makes all your mages very difficult for enemy mages to combat. In the base game, enemy mages oftentimes will not even have the anti-spell spells needed to both remove the spell shield and then eat through all your spell protections. So if you have spell shield up and spell deflection and spell turning and a spell immunity abjuration, you're pretty much protected against any single target nasty spell that could come at you. And you're also protected against dispel or remove magic, so you can keep your resistances and your stone skin up. You become this sort of armadillo or turtle that has completely protected yourselves from all sides, and then your one soft spot or your stomach that would normally be vulnerable to these anti-spell spells, you take a spell shield and you slap it on top of that so that there's nowhere you can be attacked. It's pretty cool. You sort of complete your defenses with this spell. A neat spell, one that's good to layer on top of others. There's There's no reason not to cast this on yourself, considering that you're potentially keeping up your much higher level spell protections through a level 5 spell by the time you get to late game. And this is just a good spell. Has utility all the way through the second half of BG2 whenever you're facing enemy mages or enemies that cast nasty single target spells against you. And especially in TOB and late game, this is a nice protection to have up. And again, like spell immunity, in SCS, the value of this only goes up. In SCS, enemy mages are going to be a lot more proficient at taking down your spell protections. They're going to be a lot more aggressive. They're going to cast many more instances of Spell Strike or Ruby Ray against you. And that just makes Spell Shield even better in SCS. Even in the base game, a quality spell, and I'll rate this spell an 8 out of 10 for Spell Shield. Okay, here we are at the last spell in level 5. And maybe my take here is going to be one of the more controversial takes of ratings in level 5. But we'll get into it here. I'll read the spell description first. So Sunfire has a cast time of 3, quite short cast time. AoE of a 15-foot radius around the caster. Saving throw for half damage, like many damage spells. A Sunfire is like a fireball, an explosive burst of flame, which detonates with a low roar and delivers damage proportional to the level of the caster. 1d6 points of damage per level of the caster, up to a maximum of 15d6. The wizard gestures with her hand, and the entire area around her erupts in flames, striking everyone except the caster herself. Creatures failing their saving throws take full damage from the blast. Those who roll successful saving throws manage to dodge, fall flat, or roll aside, each taking half damage. So, what is this? Well, it's a fireball that's centered on the caster and explodes around the caster in an equal AoE to the fireball spell. You could say it's just a fireball spell, except there are two important differences. First, this caps out at 15d6 at level 15 instead of fireball capping out at 10d6. That's very important. 50% more damage, always nice. And second, this cannot be aimed. It always drops on top of the mage and detonates right there. I'm going to talk about quite a bit about that mechanic a little bit later. But clearly, just based on doing 50% more damage, this is a better spell than Fireball. In some versions of the game, I think before patches, this spell ignored MR. That was magic resistance, that is. That was really a coding error or a bug that now seems to be fixed. Needless to say, if you have one of the games where, or one of the versions of this game where Sunfire ignores magic resistance, like this instantly becomes one of the best damage spells in the game. But it shouldn't work that way, right? It's a magic spell like everything else. There's nothing in the description or the lore that would explain why it would go through MR. It shouldn't go through MR. And in latest installs, I tested this out, and it does not go through MR. So that's fixed. There's something about, I guess, some useless game history. This is still a good spell, and I'll talk about the dynamic of the fact that you have to cast it on yourself and then it explodes out from in a circle around the mage in a little bit. But first, I think it's worth addressing, why is this a good damage spell, even though it does fire damage, which is one of the most commonly, it's the most commonly resisted type of spell damage in the game. Why is it still a good spell when it does fire damage? So I think to answer that, the way I think about it, we got to sort of go through the entire Arcane spellbook and think about what the optimal sources of damage are at which levels, and whether it makes sense to take fire damage at other levels, or whether the damage types that you have at other levels are going to be different types of damage, because if the best damage spell is a fire spell in like 3 other spell levels, then it becomes very hard to take Sunfire. You're just going to end up with all this fire damage, and the second you face a fire resistant or immune enemy, you're going to have no versatility. So it sort of depends when you're coming up with your entire arsenal of damage spells. It sort of depends what you're doing at different levels and how you get some versatility in your spell book. So let's go through the levels. At level 1, for damage, you're using Magic Missile. If you want level 1 damage, pretty much at all points in the saga, past like very early in BG1, where you might say Burning Hands, like realistically, it's Magic Missile at level 1. It does magic damage. There's multiple bullets. It's instant cast with Amulet of Power. Okay, Magic Missile. So you're not doing fire damage at level 1. Level 2, there's really no good damage spells, full stop. I guess the best one is Acid Arrow, but that's really not very good. You're going to be filling up level 2 with buffs. You're definitely not doing fire damage. You're definitely not taking like Agonizer's Scorcher and casting that at any point in the saga, really. Level 3, Skull Trap is amazing. It does magic damage. When you're thinking about doing damage, Skull Trap is one of your main sources. It's an arcane caster. So you have no way you're taking Fireball over Skull Trap at level 3. Skull Trap is awesome. Level 4, there's really no damage spells. Ice Storm is super crappy. Don't even count that. It doesn't do fire damage anyway, but level 4 is about buffs. Level 5, okay. Of the different damage spells in level 5, I already talked about the 2 other ones, which are Cloudkill and Cone of Cold, and the problems with those spells. Sunfire is the best damage spell in level 5. It just is. The only damage spell that does more than it is Cone of Cold, except it's impossible to aim, and it has this item destruction mechanic. And there's some advantages to Sunfire I'll get to later, which Cone of Cold does not have. So this is the best damage spell in level 5. All right, so level 5, the best damage spell, which is a pretty good spell, it does fire damage. Level 6, only damage spell is Chain Lightning. Pretty weak spell, no fire. Level 7, no damage spells at all in the base game. Level 8, you have Abby Dalzim's Horrid Wilting and Incendiary Cloud. So I don't want to get into level 8 spells right now. We'll get into this later. Incendiary Cloud is not a bad spell. It would be your major source of fire damage, I think. That's like the other candidate besides Sunfire. But we'll get into it later. Abby Dalzim's is just better. It's the best damage spell in the entire game. Like you want to just keep stocking it and stock as much of it as you can. So at level 8, you're not really going to have that much fire damage either, just because you have something even better. At level 9, you have Comet and Dragon's Breath, but for the spell level and the other amazing spells that you get at that level, it's really hard to justify loading up on just some fire damage with your level 9 spell slots. And again, I'm getting ahead of ourselves. Like, we're going to get into level 9 spells and talk all about it. But suffice to say, like, if I'm optimizing my arcane casters, I'm not taking these fire damage spells at level 8 and 9 when there are just better alternatives. So at the end of the day, that's a lot of sum up to say that Sunfire is the one spell level where this fire damage spell is the best damage spell in the level and is also a pretty good spell. And you have room in your spell book for it. So, like, big picture, on many runs, Sunfire is the only fire damage that I have in my entire party. And if there are enemies that happen to not be fire resistant, which become fewer and fewer throughout the saga, because demons are and dragons are and the ball spawn are. But if there are enemies that are not fire resistant, then my go-to is Sunfire to try to damage those enemies. And for everybody else, I'm stocking Abby Dalzim's and Skull Traps, because magic damage will hit basically every enemy in the game. But if you don't take Sunfire at level 5, then you really are going to lack any fire damage at all. And, you know, fire damage isn't so useless that there's a reason to completely avoid it. So if you stock Sunfire, then I think you're going to have an appropriate amount of fire damage in your Arcane book, considering that it might be the only fire damage spell that you have in your entire arsenal. And that makes this spell have a place, even though fire resistance is pretty common. For enemies that are fire resistant, you can kill them with skull traps or Abidalzims or however else you want to kill them. Just debuff them and kill them with physical damage, whatever. And then for enemies that are vulnerable to fire damage, I like using Sunfire against those enemies. The criticism that you could have of this spell, I think there's probably two things you could look at. Number one is the fact that versus some of the best damage spells in the game, this only does 15d6 points of damage instead of scaling all the way to level 20. Yeah, that's valid, but this has an ultra quick cast time of 3 as well for a level 5 spell. So, it's possible to get a lot of these out inside an improved alacrity. This is instant cast with Robe of Vecna, and it only is a cast time of 2 if you only have Amulet of Power on. So that makes a difference. You're going to have more time to do other things to deal damage during the round if you're casting this spell. And on the whole, there's not that many damage spells in the game that scale all the way to level 20. There's just not. Skull Trap does. That's why it's amazing. Fireball and Lightning Bolt do not. Chain Lightning does not scale all the way up to 20d6. Cone of Cold does, but it has these other deficiencies. There's just not that many spells that scale all the way to level 20 truly when it comes to damage spells. So yeah, this spell would be better if it was 20d6, but 15d6 is still a very healthy amount of damage, especially considering the fast cast time. The other criticism that you could make of this spell is that it's hard to actually use it because the mage can't cast the spell while other party members are nearby, and it can't be aimed away from the party. So you have to run your mage into the center of enemies and then cast it, and then you probably want to get your mage out of the area after that. Yes, this is true. But a few different factors that are mitigating factors, and actually I think are an advantage to how this spell works, given that this is a unique dynamic and allows you to hit enemies pretty quick in the right situation. So first of all, I think if you're playing this game correctly and you're playing it on high difficulty levels, maybe you have the double damage on. Then you're going to be very focused on having high fire resistance on your entire party, or as much of your party as you can. And it's probably not going to be the end of the world if you have to have one of your fighters inside the range of a Sunfire, given that you're going to have resistances up on a lot of your party. Especially arcane casters should have protection from fire up, or other, protection from the elements at minimum, which is 75% damage reduction. So in most situations, it's not the end of the world to catch a couple members of your party inside the spell. Second, by the time you have access to level 5 spells, your mage is going to have Stone Skin, Mirror Image, Haste, etc. Your mage at that point is tankier than most fighters, and it's really not a big deal to sprint into battle with Boots of Speed plus improved Haste or Haste, get this spell off, which only has a cast time of 3, and then get out. And if you have access to improved alacrity later on in the game, you're not even going to have to get out, because you can run up, spam this spell 5 times with instant cast with Vecna, and if anything around you is not 100% resistant to fire, it's going to be completely dead when you're done with that. So you're not even going to have to worry about running away. So this idea that it's too scary to move your mage into battle to cast this, I've just never found that to be the case. It's pretty easy to sprint in, cast this, and run out as a mage. And then I think you got to consider the flip side of the fact that this spell casts itself on top of the mage, centered on the mage. And the flip side of that is that this spell is very quick at damaging enemies. which is really important for cheesing down, for lack of a better word. I mean, I don't think it's that cheesy. It's part of the game, but it's important for damaging enemies, and particularly enemy spellcasters, before they can get their protections up or before they can do nasty things to you. So every other damage spell in the game, in the Arcane book, except for I think the Bigby's spells, which have other problems with them, but like we'll get to Bigby's later and why those spells are actually underrated, and I think they're not actually that crappy. And one reason is that they do instant damage, or they can do instant damage. But except for the Bigby's spells in the Arcane book, all of your damage spells are going to be projectile based, right? You need to cast a magic missile. The missile's sprites need to appear on the screen. They need to move to the enemy and then detonate. You need to cast a skull trap. It has to appear. It has to move to the area where you cast it and then go off. Abby Delzim's, same thing. All these different damage effects have a projectile element. Now, the way that Sunfire is coded, on the other hand, and by the way, on an AoE spell, the way that the damage works is that there's some slight delay in the damage spreading out from the center of wherever the projectile goes off, but that's almost instantaneous. And the real source of delay is the projectile emanating from the caster, moving to the spot where it detonates, and then actually detonating. Now, what Sunfire does, the way it's coded, is, by the way, this could not be more specific and nerd-like, getting into this extreme level of detail about projectiles and shit. But honestly, this is one of the reasons why Sunfire is a good spell, and you should try it if you're not using it, is what I'm talking about right now. So I'm trying to explain it fully. The way Sunfire works is it drops on top of the mage that cast it instantaneously. There's zero travel time. The projectile doesn't need to emanate out and move anywhere. It just drops. And so that means that, and as soon as it drops, it detonates over the whole AoE. And it detonates ahead of where, the graphic of the fire expanding out goes. So this spell is actually the fastest way to get damage out in the entire game out of the Arcane book, with the exception of Bigby's. But let's ignore Bigby's because it's a high level spell that's single target, doesn't do a lot of damage at all. Just forget about that. This is the only real damage spell that does real damage that explodes instantly upon you casting it. And again, it has a cast time of 3, which reduces to 0 with Vecna. So what you can do with Sunfire is you can kill a lot of enemies before they pose problems for you. And particularly with enemy mages, you can kill or interrupt a lot of enemy mages before they can get their protections up, only if you detonate a Sunfire on yourself. If you were to cast a projectile, by the time the projectile flies out and goes off, the mages already have their protections up. A classic example of this is that Sunfire is the best spell in the game to kill cowled wizards that try to teleport in and kill you if you use magic in Ethkatla. You can isolate your mage, cast. If you have Alacrity, you cast Alacrity. Otherwise, you just cast some spell to summon in the cowled wizards. And then as soon as they appear, you can drop a Sunfire on yourself and kill half the mages that spawned before their protections even go up. And there's lots of other situations where, an enemy is about to do something nasty, and maybe there's one or two of your party members in the AoE, but you're going to interrupt that mage if you can drop a Sunfire on them right away. So that's very situationally useful, and you really don't get that out of any other damage spell that's an AoE spell and is worth taking in the entire game.
What is it?
Okay. A lot of talking about how Sunfire works, but that speed of damage mechanic is pretty important, especially with Vecna, and especially once you get to improved Alacrity. I find it to be very handy, and I also find that this ends up being the source of fire damage in my arcane spell books by the time I get to late TOB. You can't overstock fire damage. If you have it at multiple levels, then whenever you run into an enemy that's fire resistant fully, which there are a lot, you're going to feel like you overstocked. But you can take one spell level worth of fire damage spells, and this is a great one to take. 15d6 is pretty decent. The cast time of 3 is a nice effect, and I actually think that this dynamic of it dropping on top of the caster and then immediately detonating is, on the whole, more favorable instead of being a disadvantage. Just because it's unique to this spell, there's really nothing else in the Arcane book that matches it for speed of doing damage. So I think Sunfire is clearly the best damage spell in this level. It's not as good as the absolute best magic damage spells in the game, which are doing magic damage type, Skull Trap, and Abby Dalzims. It's not as good as those spells, but this is still a quality damage spell that I find myself taking a lot throughout the saga, and it's good right when you get it to run up and nuke lower level enemies, and it's still good all the way through TOB. Once you have Alacrity and Vecna, then you can instantly nuke any enemies that are not fully fire resistant with this spell. So a quality spell, nice damage spell. I always find myself taking it, and I will rate Sunfire an 8 out of 10. Okay, that is the end of this guide for level 5 spells. I said this at the beginning, but this is a spell level where there's sort of this cluster of higher quality, really cool, great spells, and then there's a big gap down to a bunch of garbage and an unusual amount of very poor spells that you'd never want to take at this level. The highlights are Spell Immunity and Spell Shield, great spell protections. Sunfire, a nice damage spell, one of the better damage spells in the game, and I think the best fire type damage spell in the game considering the level. You have lower resistance, which is one of the few ways to attack magic resistant enemies. Animate Dead, the first really awesome summons that you get in the Arcane book. Quality spell, especially in BG1. Breach, the bread and butter, certainly if you're not overly leveled and so remove magic is not going to be working for you. Breach is the bread and butter for dispelling enemy combat protections. And that's sort of the core. These are the spells, especially if you're doing a sorcerer build, like level 5 is actually one of your simpler spell levels. You're going to be picking the spells that you're taking out of this top group of quality spells up here. Then I think there's a big delta down to sort of some decent crowd control spells with Chaos and Feeblemind and Hold Monster, with Chaos being by far the best of those. Cloudkill and Cone of Cold, damage spells that are okay, but have some significant limitations. And then you get down to the absolute trash at the bottom here. Conjure Lesser Earth Elemental and Lesser Air Elemental, both no good. Phantom Blade, a magical weapon that you don't want because you can't fight with it because you're a mage. And Oracle, a divination spell that sort of was left with no spot in the game given how Detect Invis ended up being coded. Of course, Monster Summoning 3 and Protection from Normal Weapons also down here is some of the worst spells in the Arcane book. Level 5 overall, a great spell level, some new spell mechanics, some stuff that makes you extra powerful all the way through the saga, some stuff that's super powerful like these skeletons right when you get them. And this was fun to go over. Next up, we'll be talking about level 6. Level 6 is a mixed bag. I don't think I've thought critically about a lot of the spells in level 6. There's definitely some super, at least one super busted spell and a couple other very strong ones. So that should be a fun level. I've enjoyed doing these guides. I've loved reading everybody's comments, and I'll see you at level 6.